Chapter 24 of Miss Mackenzie by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kirsten Weber. Chapter 24. The Little Story of the Lion and the Lamb. During those 3 months of October, November, and December, Mr. Maguire was certainly not idle. He had, by means of pertinacious inquiry, learned a good deal about Miss Mackenzie. Indeed, he had learned most of the facts which the reader knows, though not quite all of them. He had seen Jonathan Ball's will, and he had seen Walter Mackenzie's will. He had ascertained, through Miss Colza, that John Ball now claimed the property by some deed said to have been executed by Jonathan Ball previous to the execution of his will, and he had also learned, from Miss Mackenzie's own lips in Lady Ball's presence, that she had engaged herself to marry the man who was thus claiming her property. Why should Mr. Ball want to marry her, who would in such case be penniless, but that he felt himself compelled in that way to quell all further inquiry into the thing that he was doing? And why should she desire to marry him, but that in this way she might, as it were, go on with her own property, and not lose the value of it herself when compelled to surrender it to her cousin? That she would have given herself with all her property to him, Mr. Maguire, a few months ago, Mr. Maguire felt fully convinced, and, as I have said before, had some ground for such conviction. He had learned also from Miss Colza that Miss Mackenzie had certainly quarrelled with Lady Ball, and that she had, so Miss Colza believed, been turned out of the house at the Suitors. Whether Mr. Ball had or had not abandoned his matrimonial prospects, Miss Colza could not quite determine. Having made up her mind to hate Miss Mackenzie, and therefore, as was natural, thinking that no gentleman could really like such a poor dowdy creature, she rather thought that he had abandoned his matrimonial prospects. Mr. Maguire had thus learned much on the subject, but he had not learned this, that John Ball was honest throughout in the matter, and that the lawyers employed in it were honest also. And now, having got together all this information, and he himself being in somewhat precarious condition as to his own affairs, Mr. Maguire resolved upon using his information boldly. He had a not incorrect idea of the fitness of things, and did not fail to tell himself that were he at the moment in possession of those clerical advantages which his labours in the vineyard should have earned for him, he would not have run the risk which he must undoubtedly incur by engaging himself in this matter. Had he a full church at Littlebath depending on him, had Mr. Stumfold's chance and Mr. Stumfold's success been his, had he still even been an adherent of the Stumfoldian fold, he would have paused before he rushed to the public with an account of Miss Mackenzie's grievance. But as matters stood with him, looking round upon his own horizon, he did not see that he had any course before him more likely to lead to good pecuniary results than this. The reader has been told how Mr. Maguire went to Arundel Street, and how he was there received, but that reception did not at all daunt his courage. It showed him that the lady was still under the Ball influence, and that his ally, Miss Colza, was probably wrong in supposing that the Ball marriage was altogether off. But this only made him the more determined to undermine that influence, and to prevent that marriage. If he could once succeed in convincing the lady that her best chance of regaining her fortune lay in his assistance, or if he could even convince her that his interference must result, either with or without her good wishes, in dividing her altogether from the Ball alliance, then she would be almost compelled to throw herself into his arms. That she was violently in love with him he did not suppose, nor did he think it at all more probable that she should be violently in love with her cousin. He put her down in his own mind as one of those weak, good women who can bring themselves easily to love any man, and who are sure to make useful wives because they understand so thoroughly the nature of obedience. If he could secure for her her fortune, and could divide her from John Ball, he had but little doubt that she would come to him, in spite of the manner in which she had refused to receive him in Arundel Street. Having considered all this, after the mode of thinking which I have attempted to describe, he went to work with such weapons as were readiest to his hands. As a first step, he wrote boldly to John Ball. In this letter he reasserted the statement he had made to Lady Ball as to Miss Mackenzie's engagement to himself, and added some circumstances which he had not mentioned to Lady Ball. He said that, having become engaged to that lady, he had, in consequence, given up his curacy at Littlebath, and otherwise so disarranged his circumstances as to make it imperative upon him to take the steps which he was now taking. He had come up to London, expecting to find her anxious to receive him in Gower Street, and had then discovered that she had been taken away to the Suitors. He could not, he said, give any adequate description of his surprise when, on arriving there, he heard from the mouth of his own Margaret that she was now engaged to her cousin. But if his surprise then had been great and terrible, how much greater and more terrible must it have been when, step by step, the story of that claim upon her fortune revealed itself to him. He pledged himself in his letter, as a gentleman and as a Christian minister, to see the matter out. He would not allow Miss Mackenzie to be despoiled of her fortune and her hand, both of which he had a right to regard as his own, without making known to the public a transaction which he regarded as nefarious. Then there was a good deal of eloquent indignation, the nature and purport of which the reader will probably understand. Mr. Ball did not at all like this letter. He had that strong feeling of disinclination to be brought before the public with reference to his private affairs, which is common to all Englishmen, and he specially had a dislike to this, seeing that there would be a question not only as to money, but also as to love. A gentleman does not like to be accused of a dishonest attempt to possess himself of a lady's property, but at the age of 50, even that is almost better than one which charges him with such attempt against a lady's heart. He knew that he was not dishonest, and therefore could endure the first. He was not quite sure that he was not, or might not become, ridiculous, and therefore feared the latter very greatly. He could not ignore the letter, and there was nothing for it but to show it to his lawyer. Unfortunately, he had told his lawyer, on the very day of Mr. Maguire's visit to the Cedars, that all was to be made smooth by his marriage with Miss Mackenzie, and now, with much misery and many inward groanings, he had to explain all this story of Mr. Maguire. It was the more painful in that he had to admit that an offer had been made to the lady by the clergyman, and had not been rejected. "You don't think there was more than that?" asked the lawyer, having paved the way for this question with sundry apologetic flourishes. "I am sure there was not," said John Ball. "She is as true as the gospel, and he is as false as the devil." "Oh, yes," said the lawyer. "There's no doubt about his falsehood. He's one of those fellows for whom nothing is too dirty. Clergymen are like women. As long as they're pure, they're a long sight purer than other men. But when they fall, they sink deeper." "You needn't be afraid of taking her word," said John Ball. "If all women were as pure as she is, there wouldn't be much amiss with them." His eyes glittered as he spoke of her, and it was a pity that Margaret could not have heard him then, and seen him there. "You don't think she has been just a little foolish, you know?" "I think she was very foolish in not bidding such a man to go about his business at once. But she has not been more so than what she owns. She is as brave as she is good, and I don't think she would keep anything back." The result was that a letter was written by the lawyer to Mr. Maguire, telling Mr Maguire that any further communication should be made to him, and also making a slight suggestion as to the pains and penalties which are incurred in the matter of a libel. Mr Maguire had dated his letter from Littlebath, and there the answer reached him. He had returned thither, having found that he could take no further immediate steps towards furthering his cause in London. And now, what steps should he take next? More than once he thought of putting his own case into the hands of a lawyer. But what was a lawyer to do for him? An action for breach of promise was open to him, but he had wit enough to feel that there was very little chance of success for him in that line. He might instruct a lawyer to look into Miss Mackenzie's affairs, and he thought it probable that he might find a lawyer to take such instructions. But there would be much expense in this, and probably no result. Advancing logically from one conclusion to another, he at last resolved that he must rush boldly into print, and lay the whole inquiry of the transaction open to the public. He believed, I think he did believe, that the woman was being wronged. Some particle of such belief he had, and fostering himself with this, he sat himself down and wrote a leading article. Now there existed in Littlebath at this time a weekly periodical called the Christian Examiner, with which Mr Maguire had for some time had dealings. He had written for the paper, taking an earnest part in local religious subjects, and the paper in return had very frequently spoken highly of Mr Maguire's eloquence and of Mr Maguire's energy. There had been a give and take in this, which all people understand who are conversant with the provincial, or perhaps I might add, with the metropolitan press of the country. The paper in question was not a wicked paper, nor were the gentlemen concerned in its publication intentionally scurrilous or malignant, but it was subject to those great temptations which beset all class of newspapers of the kind, and to avoid which seems to be almost more difficult in handling religious subjects than in handling any other. The editor of a Christian Examiner, if, as is probable, he have of his own very strong and one-sided religious convictions, will think that those who differ from him are in a perilous way, and, so thinking, will feel himself bound to tell them so. The man who advocates one line of railway instead of another, or one prime minister as being superior to all others, does not regard his opponents as being fatally wrong for this world and for the next, and he can restrain himself. But how is a newspaper writer to restrain himself when his opponent is incurring everlasting punishment, or, worse still, carrying away others to a similar doom, in that they read and perhaps even purchase that which the lost one has written? In this way the contents of religious newspapers are apt to be personal, and heavy, biting, scorching attacks become the natural vehicle of Christian Examiners. Mr Maguire sat down and wrote his leading article, which on the following Saturday appeared in all the glory of large type. The article shall not be repeated here at length, because it contained sundry quotations from Holy Writ, which may as well be omitted, but the purport of it shall be explained. It commenced with a dissertation against an undue love of wealth, the auri sacra fames, as the writer called it, and described with powerful unction the terrible straits into which, when indulged, it led the vile, wicked, ugly, hideous, loathsome, devilish human heart. Then there was an eloquent passage referring to worms and dust and grass, and a quotation respecting treasures, both corruptible and incorruptible. Not at once, but with crafty gradations, the author sloped away to the point of his subject. How fearful was it to watch the way in which the strong wicked ones beguile the ignorance of the innocent and lead lonely lambs into their slaughter-houses. All this, much amplified, made up half the article, And then, after the manner of a pleasant relater of anecdotes, the clerical storyteller began with his little tale. When, however, he came to the absolute writing of the tale, he found it to be prudent, for the present, to omit the names of his hero and heroine, to omit, indeed, the names of all the persons concerned. He had first intended boldly to dare it all, and perhaps would yet have done so, had he been quite sure of his editor. But his editor, he found, might object to these direct personalities at the first sound of the trumpet, unless the communication were made in the guise of a letter, with Mr Maguire's name at the end of it. After a while, the editor might become hot in the fight himself, and then the names could be blazoned forth. And there existed some chance, some small chance, that the robber lion, John Ball, might be induced to drop his lamb from his mouth when he heard this premonitory blast, and then the lion's prey might be picked up by the bold hunter, Mr Maguire would probably have said, had he been called upon to finish the sentence himself. Anyone else might perhaps say, by the jackal. The little story was told, therefore, without the mention of any names. Mr Maguire had read other little stories told in another way, or in other newspapers, of greater weight, no doubt, than the Littlebath Christian Examiner, and had thought that he could wield a thunderbolt as well as any other Jupiter. But in wielding thunderbolts, as in all other operations of skill, a man must first try his prentice hand with some reticence, and thus he reconciled himself to prudence, not without some pangs of conscience, which accused him inwardly of cowardice. Not long ago there was a lady in this town, loved and respected by all who knew her. Thus he began, and then gave a not altogether inaccurate statement of the whole affair, dropping, of course, his own share in the concern, and accusing the vile, wicked, hideous, loathsome human heart of the devouring lion, who lived some miles to the west end of London, of a brutal desire and a hellish scheme to swallow up the inheritance of the innocent, loved, and respected lamb, in spite of the closest ties of consanguinity between them. And then he went on to tell how, with a base desire of covering up from the eyes of an indignant public his bestial greediness in having made this dishonest meal, the lion had proposed to himself the plan of marrying the lamb. It was a pity that Mr Maguire had not learned, that Miss Colza had not been able to tell him, that the lion had once before expressed his wish to take the lamb for his wife. Had he known that, what a picture he would have drawn of the disappointed, vindictive king of the forest, as, lying in his lair at Twickenham, he meditated his foul revenge. This, unfortunately, was unknown to Mr Maguire, and unsuspected by him. But the article did not end here. The indignant writer of it went on to say that he had buckled on his armour in support of the lamb, and that he was ready to meet the lion either in the forest or in any social circle, either in the courts of law or before any Christian arbitrator. With loud trumpetings he summoned the lion to appear and plead guilty, or to stand forward if he dared, and declare himself innocent with his hand on his heart. If the lion could prove himself to be innocent, the writer of that article offered him the right hand of fellowship, an offer which the lion would not regard as any strong inducement. But if the lion were not innocent, if, as the writer of that article was well aware was the case, the lion was basely, greedily, bestially guilty, then the writer of that article pledged himself to give the lion no peace till he had disgorged his prey, and till the lamb was free to come back, with all her property, to that Christian circle in Littlebath which had loved her so warmly and respected her so thoroughly. Such was the nature of the article, and the editor put it in. After all, what, in such matters, is an editor to do? Is it not his business to sell his paper? And if the editor of a Christian Examiner cannot trust the clergyman he has sat under, whom can he trust? Some risk an editor is obliged to run, or he will never sell his paper. There could be little doubt that such an article as this would be popular among the religious world of Littlebath, and that it would create a demand. He had his misgivings, had that poor editor. He did not feel quite sure of his lion and his lamb. He talked the matter over vehemently with Mr. Maguire in the little room in which he occupied himself with his scissors and paste, but ultimately the article was inserted. Who does not know that interval of triumph which warms a man's heart when he has delivered his blow, and the return blow has not yet been received? The blow has been so well struck that it must be successful, nay, may probably be death-dealing. So felt Mr. Maguire when 24 copies of the Christian Examiner were delivered at his lodgings on the Saturday morning. The article, though printed as a leading article, had been headed as a little story, "The Lion and the Lamb," so that it might more readily attract attention. It read very nicely in print. It had all that religious unction which is so necessary for Christian Examiners, and with it that spice of devilry so delicious to humanity that without it even Christian Examiners cannot be made to sell themselves. He was very busy with his 24 damp copies before him, 24 which had been sent to him by agreement as the price of his workmanship. He made them up and directed them with his own hand. To the Lion and the Lamb he sent 2 copies, 2 to each. To Mr. Slow he sent a copy, and another to Messrs. Slow and Bideawhile, and a third to the other lawyer. He sent a copy to Lady Ball, and one to Sir John. Another he sent to the old Mackenzie, baronet at Injarrow, and 2 more to the baronet's eldest son and the baronet's eldest son's wife. A copy he sent to Mrs. Tom Mackenzie, and a copy to Miss Colza, and a copy also he sent to Mrs. Buggins, and he sent a copy to the chairman of the board at the Shadrach Fire Office, and another to the chairman at the Abednego Life Office. A copy he sent to Mr. Samuel Rubb, Jr., and a copy to Messrs. Rubb and Mackenzie. Out of his own pocket he supplied the postage stamps, and with his own hand he dropped the papers into the Littlebath post office. Poor Miss Mackenzie, when she read the article, was stricken almost to the ground. How she did hate the man whose handwriting on the address she recognized at once. What should she do? In her agony she almost resolved that she would start at once for the Suitors, and profess her willingness to go before all the magistrates in London and Littlebath, and swear that her cousin was no lion and that she was no lamb. At that moment her feelings towards the Christians and Christian Examiners of Littlebath were not the feelings of a Griselda. I think she could have spoken her mind freely had Mr. Maguire come in her way. Then, when she saw Mrs. Buggins's copy, her anger blazed up afresh, and her agony became more intense. The horrid man must have sent copies all over the world, or he would never have thought of sending a copy to Mrs. Buggins. But she did not go to the Suitors. She reflected that, when there, she might probably find her cousin absent, and in such case she would hardly know how to address herself to her aunt. Mr. Ball, too, might perhaps come to her, and for 3 days she patiently awaited his coming. On the evening of the 3rd day there came to her, not Mr. Ball, but a clerk from Mr. Slow, the same clerk who had been with her before, and he made an appointment with her at Mr. Slow's office on the following morning. She was to meet Mr. Ball there, and also to meet Mr. Ball's lawyer. Of course she consented to go, and of course she was on Mr Slow's staircase exactly at the time appointed. Of what she was thinking as she walked round Lincoln's Inn Fields to kill a quarter of an hour which she found herself to have on hand, we will not now inquire. She was shown at once into Mr Slow's room, and the first thing that met her eyes was a copy of that horrible Christian Examiner lying on the table before him. She knew it instantly, and would have known it had she simply seen a corner of the printing. To her eyes and to her mind, no other printed paper had ever been so ugly and so vicious. But she saw that there was also another newspaper under the Christian Examiner. Mr Slow brought her to the fire and gave her a chair, and was very courteous. In a few moments came the other lawyer, and with him came John Ball. Mr Slow opened the conference, all the details of which need not be given here. He first asked Miss Mackenzie whether she had seen that wicked libel. She, with much energy, and I may almost say with virulence, declared that the horrid paper had been sent to her. She hoped that nobody suspected that she had known anything about it. In answer to this they all assured her that she need not trouble herself on that head. Mr Slow then told her that a London paper had copied the whole story of the Lion and the Lamb, expressing a hope that the lion would be exposed if there was any truth in it, and the writer would be exposed if there was none. "The writer was Mr Maguire, a clergyman," said Miss Mackenzie with indignation. "We all know that," said Mr Slow, with a slight smile on his face. Then he went on reading the remarks of the London paper, which declared that the Littlebath Christian Examiner, having gone so far, must of necessity go further. The article was calculated to give the greatest pain to, no doubt, many persons, and the innocence or guilt of the Lion, as poor John Ball was called, must be made manifest to the public. "And now, my dear Miss Mackenzie, I will tell you what we propose to do," said Mr Slow. He then explained that it was absolutely necessary that a question of law should be tried and settled in a court of law between her and her cousin. When she protested against this, he endeavoured to explain to her that the cause would be an amicable cause, a simple reference, in short, to a legal tribunal. Of course she did not understand this, and of course she still protested. But after a while, when she began to perceive that her protest was of no avail, she let that matter drop. The cause should be brought on as soon as possible, but could not be decided till late in the spring. She was told that she had better make no great change in her own manner of life till that time, and was again informed that she could have what money she wanted for her own maintenance. She refused to take any money, but when the reference was made to some proposed change in her life, she looked wistfully into her cousin's face. He, however, had nothing to say then, and kept his eyes intently fixed upon the carpet. Mr Slow then took up the Christian Examiner, and declared to her what was their intention with reference to that. A letter should be written from his house to the editor of the London newspaper, giving a plain statement of the case, with all the names, explaining that all the parties were acting in perfect concert, and that the matter was to be decided in the only way which could be regarded as satisfactory. In answer to this, Miss Mackenzie, almost in tears, pointed out how distressing would be the publicity thus given to her name, particularly. She said particularly. But she could not go on with the expression of her thoughts, or explain that so public a reference to a proposal of marriage from her cousin must be doubly painful to her, seeing that the idea of such a marriage had been abandoned. But Mr Slow understood all this, and coming over to her, took her gently by the hand. "My dear," he said, "you may trust me in this as though I were your father. I know that such publicity is painful, but believe me, It is the best that we can do." Of course she had no alternative but to yield. When the interview was over, her cousin walked home with her to Arundel Street, and said much to her as to the necessity for this trial. He said so much that she at last dimly understood that the matter could not be set at rest by her simple renouncing of the property. Her own lawyer could not allow her to do so, nor could he, John Ball, consent to receive the property in such a manner. "You see by that newspaper what people would say of me." But had he not the power of making everything easy by doing that which he himself had before proposed to do? Why did he not say again, "Margaret, come and be my wife"? She acknowledged to herself that he had a right to act as though he had never said those words, that the facts elicited by Mr Maguire's visit to the Suitors were sufficient to absolve him from his offer. But yet she thought that they should have been sufficient also to induce him to renew it. On that occasion, when he left her at the door in Arundel Street, he had not renewed his offer. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Miss Mackenzie by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kirsten Wever. Chapter 25. Lady Ball in Arundel Street. On Christmas Day, Miss Mackenzie was pressed very hard to eat her Christmas dinner with Mr and Mrs Buggins, and she almost gave way. She had some half-formed idea in her head that should she once sit down to table with Buggins, she would have given up the fight altogether. She had no objection to Buggins, and had indeed no strong objection to put herself on a par with Buggins, but she felt that she could not be on a par with Buggins and with John Ball at the same time. Why it should be that in associating with the man she would take a step downwards, and might yet associate with the man's wife without taking any step downwards, she did not attempt to explain to herself. But I think that she could have explained it, had she put herself to the task of analysing the question, and that she felt exactly the result of such analysis without making it. At any rate, she refused the invitation persistently, and ate her wretched dinner alone in her bedroom. She had often told herself, in those days of her philosophy at Littlebath, that she did not care to be a lady, and she told herself now the same thing very often when she was thinking of the hospital. She cosseted herself with no false ideas as to the nature of the work which she proposed to undertake. She knew very well that she might have to keep rougher company than that of Buggins, if she put her shoulder to that wheel. She was willing enough to do this, and had been willing to encounter such company ever since she left the Suitors. She was prepared for the roughness, but she would not put herself beyond the pale, as it were, of her cousin's hearth, moved simply by a temptation to relieve the monotony of her life. When the work came within her reach, she would go to it, but till then she would bear the wretchedness of her dull room upstairs. She wondered whether he ever thought how wretched she must be in her solitude. On New Year's Day she heard that her uncle was dead. She was already in mourning for her brother, and was therefore called upon to make no change in that respect. She wrote a note of condolence to her aunt, in which she strove much, and vainly, to be cautious and sympathetic at the same time, and in return received a note in which Lady Ball declared her purpose of coming to Arundel Street to see her niece as soon as she found herself able to leave the house. She would, she said, give Margaret warning the day beforehand, as it would be very sad if she had her journey all for nothing. Her aunt, Lady Ball, was coming to see her in Arundel Street. What could be the purpose of such a visit, after all that had passed between them? And why should her aunt trouble herself to make it at a period of such great distress? Lady Ball must have some very important plan to propose, and poor Margaret's heart was in a flutter. It was 10 days after this before the second promised note arrived, and then Margaret was asked to say whether she would be at home and able to receive her aunt's visit at 10 minutes past 2 on the day but one following. Margaret wrote back to say that she would be at home at 10 minutes past 2 on the day named. Her aunt was old, and she again borrowed the parlour, though she was not now well inclined to ask favours from Mrs. Buggins. Mrs. Buggins had taken to heart the slight put upon her husband, and sometimes made nasty little speeches. "Oh dear, yes, in course, Miss Margaret. Not that I ever did think much of them Ballses, and less than ever now, since the gentleman was kind enough to send me the newspaper. Seeing as how Mr. Tiddy will be in the city, of course, and you're welcome to it too, though you do keep yourself so close to yourself, which won't ever bring you round to have your money again, that it won't." Lady Ball came, and was shown into the parlour, and her niece went down to receive her. "I would have been here before you came, aunt, only the room is not mine." In answer to this, Lady Ball said that it did very well. Any room would answer the present purpose. Then she sat down on the sofa from which she had risen. She was dressed, of course, in the full weeds of her widowhood, and the wide extent of her black crape was almost awful in Margaret's eyes. She did not look to be so savage as her niece had sometimes seen her, but there was about her a ponderous accumulation of crape, which made her even more formidable than she used to be. It would be almost impossible to refuse anything to a person so black, so grave, so heavy, and so big. "I have come to you, my dear," she said, "as soon as I possibly could, after the sad event which we have had at home." In answer to this, Margaret said that she was much obliged, but she hoped that her aunt had put herself to no trouble. Then she said a word or two about her uncle, a word or two that was very difficult, as of course it could mean nothing. "Yes," said the widow, "he has been taken from us after a long and useful life. I hope his son will always show himself worthy of such a father." After that there was silence in the room for a minute or two, during which Margaret waited for her aunt to begin. But Lady Ball sat there, solid, grave, and black, as though she thought that her very presence, without any words, might be effective upon Margaret as a preliminary mode of attack. Margaret herself could find nothing to say to her aunt, and she therefore also remained silent. Lady Ball was so far successful in this, that when 3 minutes were over, her niece had certainly been weakened by the oppressive nature of the meeting. She had about her less of vivacity, and perhaps also less of vitality, than when she first entered the room. "Well, my dear," said her aunt at last, "there are things, you know, which must be talked about, though they are ever so disagreeable." And then she pulled out of her pocket that abominable number of the Littlebath Christian Examiner. "Oh, aunt, I hope you are not going to talk about that." "My dear, that is cowardly. It is indeed. How am I to help talking about it? I have come here from Twickenham on purpose to talk about it." "Then, aunt, I must decline. I must indeed." "My dear!" "I must indeed, aunt." Let a man or woman's vitality be ever so thoroughly crushed and quenched by fatigue or oppression, or even by black crape, there will always be some mode of galvanizing which will restore it for a time, some specific either of joy or torture which will produce a return of temporary energy. This Littlebath newspaper was a battery of sufficient power to put Margaret on her legs again, though she perhaps might not be long able to keep them. It is a vile, lying paper, and it was written by a vile, lying man, and I hope you will put it up and say nothing about it." "It is a vile, lying paper, Margaret, but the lies are against my son, and not against you." "He is a man, and knows what he is about, and it does not signify to him. But, aunt, I won't talk about it, and there's an end of it." "I hope he does know what he is about," said Lady Ball. "I hope he does. But you, as you say, are a woman, and therefore it specially behoves you to know what you are about." "I am not doing anything to anybody," said Margaret. Lady Ball had now refolded the offensive newspaper and restored it to her pocket. Perhaps she had done as much with it as she had from the first intended. At any rate, she brought it forth no more, and made no further intentionally direct allusion to it. "I don't suppose you really wish to do any injury to anybody," she said. "Does anybody accuse me of doing them an injury?" Margaret asked. "Well, my dear, if I were to say that I accused you, perhaps you would misunderstand me. I thoroughly expect that before I leave you I may be able to say that I do not accuse you. If you will only listen to me patiently for a few minutes, Margaret, which I couldn't get you to do, you know, before you went away from the Suitors in that very extraordinary manner, I think I can explain to you something which—" Here Lady Ball became embarrassed and paused, but Margaret gave her no assistance, and therefore she began a new sentence. "In point of fact, I want you to listen to what I say, and then I do think, you will do as we would have you." Whom did she include in that word "we"? Margaret had still sufficient vitality not to let the word pass by unquestioned. "You mean yourself and John?" said she. "I mean the family," said Lady Ball rather sharply. "I mean the whole family, including those dear girls to whom I have been in the position of a mother since my son's wife died. It is in the name of the Ball family that I now speak, and surely I have a right." Margaret thought that Lady Ball had no such right, but she would not say so at that moment. "Well, Margaret, to come to the point at once, the fact is this. You must renounce any idea that you may still have of becoming my son's wife." Then she paused. "Has John sent you here to say this?" demanded Margaret. "I don't wish you to ask any such question as that. If you had any real regard for him, I don't think you would ask it. Consider his difficulties, and consider the position of those poor children. If he were your brother, would you advise him, at his age, to marry a woman without a farthing, and also to incur the certain disgrace which would attach to his name after all that has been said about it in this newspaper?" Then Lady Ball put her hand upon her pocket. "In this newspaper and in others?" This was more than Margaret could bear. "There would be no disgrace," said she, jumping to her feet. "Margaret, if you put yourself into a passion, how can you understand reason? You ought to know yourself, by the very fact of your being in a passion, that you are wrong. Would there be no disgrace after all that has come out about Mr. Maguire?" "No, none, none," almost shouted this modern Griselda. "There could be no disgrace. I won't admit it. As for his marrying me, I don't expect it. There is nothing to bind him to me. If he doesn't come to me, I certainly shall not go to him. I have looked upon it as all over between him and me, and as I have not troubled him with any importunities, nor yet you, it is cruel in you to come to me in this way. He is free to do what he likes. Why don't you go to him? But there would be no disgrace." "Of course he is free. Of course such a marriage never can take place now. It is quite out of the question. You say that it is all over, and you are quite right.
Why not let this be settled in a friendly way between you and me, so that we may be friends again? I should be so glad to help you in your difficulties, if you would agree with me about this." "I want no help." "Margaret, that is nonsense. In your position you are very wrong to set your natural friends at defiance. If you will only authorize me to say that you renounce this marriage—" "I will not renounce it," said Margaret, who was still standing up. "I will not renounce it. I would sooner lose my tongue than let it say such a word. You may tell him, if you choose to tell him anything, that I demand nothing from him, nothing. All that I once thought mine is now his, and I demand nothing from him. But when he asked me to be his wife, he told me to be firm, and in that I will obey him. He may renounce me, and I shall have nothing with which to reproach him, but I will never renounce him, never." And then the modern Griselda, who had been thus galvanized into vitality, stood over her aunt in a mood that was almost triumphant. "Margaret, I am astonished at you," said Lady Ball, when she had recovered herself. "I can't help that, aunt." "And now let me tell you this. My son is, of course, old enough to do as he pleases. If he chooses to ruin himself and his children by marrying anybody, even if it were out of the streets, I can't help it. Stop a moment and hear me to the end." This she said as her niece had made a movement as though towards the door. "I say, even if it were out of the streets, I couldn't help it. But nothing shall induce me to live in the same house with him if he marries you. It will be on your conscience for ever that you have brought ruin on the whole family, and that will be your punishment. As for me, I shall take myself off to some solitude, and there I shall die." Then Lady Ball put her handkerchief up to her face and wept copiously. Margaret stood still, leaning upon the table, but she spoke no word, either in answer to the threat or the tears. Her immediate object was to take herself out of the room, but this she did not know how to achieve. At last her aunt spoke again. "If you please, I will get you to ask your landlady to send for a cab." Then the cab was procured, and Buggins, who had come home for his dinner, handed her ladyship in. Not a word had been spoken during the time that the cab was being fetched, and when Lady Ball went down the passage she merely said, "I wish you good-bye, Margaret." "Good-bye," said Margaret, and then she escaped to her own bedroom. Lady Ball had not done her work well. It was not within her power to induce Margaret to renounce her engagement, and had she known her niece better, I do not think that she would have made the attempt. She did succeed in learning that Margaret had received no renewal of an offer from her son, that there was, in fact, no positive engagement now existing between them, and with this, I think, she should have been satisfied. Margaret had declared that she had demanded nothing from her cousin, and with this assurance Lady Ball should have been contented. But she had thought to carry her point, to obtain the full swing of her will, by means of a threat, and had forgotten that in the very words of her own menace she conveyed to Margaret some intimation that her son was still desirous of doing the very thing which she was so anxious to prevent. There was no chance that her threat should have any effect on Margaret. She ought to have known that the tone of the woman's mind was much too firm for that. Margaret knew, was as sure of it as any woman could be sure, that her cousin was bound to her by all ties of honour. She believed, too, that he was bound to her by love, and that if he should finally desert it, he would be moved to do so by mean motives. It was no anger on the score of Mr. Maguire that would bring him to such a course, no suspicion that she was personally unworthy of being his wife. Our Griselda, with all her power of suffering and willingness to suffer, understood all that, and was by no means disposed to give way to any threat from Lady Ball. When she was upstairs and once more in solitude, She disgraced herself again by crying. She could be strong enough when attacked by others, but could not be strong when alone. She cried and sobbed upon her bed, and then, rising, looked at herself in the glass, and told herself that she was old and ugly, and fitted only for that hospital nursing of which she had been thinking. But still there was something about her heart that bore her up. Lady Ball would not have come to her, would not have exercised her eloquence upon her, would not have called upon her to renounce this engagement, had she not found all similar attempts upon her son to be ineffectual. Could it then be so that, after all, her cousin would be true to her? If it were so, if it could be so, what would she not do for him and for his children? If it were so, how blessed would have been all these troubles that had brought her to such a haven at last. Then she tried to reconcile his coldness to her with that which she so longed to believe might be the fact. She was not to expect him to be a lover such as are young men. Was she young herself, or would she like him better if he were to assume anything of youth in his manners? She understood that life with him was a serious thing, and that it was his duty to be serious and grave in what he did. It might be that it was essential to his character, after all that had passed, that the question of the property should be settled finally before he could come to her and declare his wishes. Thus flattering herself, she put away from her tears, and dressed herself, smoothing her hair, and washing away the traces of her weeping. And then again she looked at herself in the glass to see if it were possible that she might be comely in his eyes. The months of January and February slowly wore themselves away. During the whole of that time Margaret saw her cousin but once, and then she met him at Mr. Slow's chambers. She had gone there to sign some document, and there she had found him. She had then been told that she would certainly lose her cause. No one who had looked into the matter had any doubt of that. It certainly was the case that Jonathan Ball had bequeathed property which was not his at the time he made the will, but which, at the time of his death, in fact, absolutely belonged to his nephew, John Ball. Old Mr. Slow, as he explained this now for the 7th or 8th time, did it without a tone of regret in his voice, or a sign of sorrow in his eye. Margaret had become so used to the story now that it excited no strong feelings within her. Her wish, she said, was that the matter should be settled. The lawyer, with almost a smile on his face, but still shaking his head, said that he feared it could not be settled before the end of April. John Ball sat by, leaning his face as usual upon his umbrella, and saying nothing. It did for a moment strike Miss Mackenzie as singular that she should be reduced from affluence to absolute nothingness in the way of property in so very placid a manner. Mr. Slow seemed to be thinking that he was, upon the whole, doing rather well for his client. "Of course you understand, Miss Mackenzie, that you can have any money you require for your present personal wants." This had been said to her so often that she took it as one of Mr. Slow's legal formulas, which meant nothing to the laity. On that occasion also Mr. Ball walked home with her, and was very eloquent about the law's delays. He also seemed to speak as though there was nothing to be regretted by anybody, except the fact that he could not get possession of the property as quickly as he wished. He said not a word of anything else, and Margaret, of course, submitted to be talked to by him rather than to talk herself. Of Lady Ball's visit he had not said a word, nor did she. She asked after the children, and especially after Jack. One word she did say. "I had hoped Jack would have come to see me at my lodgings." "Perhaps he had better not," said Jack's father, "till all is settled. We have had much to trouble us at home since my father's death." Then, of course, she dropped that subject. She had been greatly startled on that day on hearing her cousin called Sir John by Mr Slow. Up to that moment it had never occurred to her that the man of whom she was so constantly thinking as her possible husband was a baronet. To have been Mrs Ball seemed to her to have been possible, but that she should become Lady Ball was hardly possible. She wished that he had not been called Sir John. It seemed to her to be almost natural that people should be convinced of the impropriety of such a one as her becoming the wife of a baronet. During this period she saw her sister-in-law once or twice, who on those occasions came down to Arundel Street. She herself would not go to Gower Street because of the presence of Miss Colza. Miss Colza still continued to live there, and still continued very much in arrear of her contributions to the household fund. Mrs Mackenzie did not turn her out, because she would, so she said, in such case get nothing. Mrs Tom was by this time quite convinced that the property would, either justly or unjustly, go into the hands of John Ball, and she was therefore less anxious to make any sacrifice to please her sister-in-law. "I'm sure I don't see why you should be so bitter against her," said Mrs Tom. "I don't suppose she told the clergyman a word that wasn't true." Miss Mackenzie declined to discuss the subject, and assured Mrs Tom that she only recommended the banishment of Miss Colza because of her apparent unwillingness to pay. "As for the money," said Mrs Tom, "I expect Mr Rubb to see to that. I suppose he intends to make her Mrs Rubb sooner or later." Miss Mackenzie, having some kindly feeling towards Mr Rubb, would have preferred to hear that Miss Colza was likely to become Mrs Maguire. During these visits Mrs Tom got more than one £5 note from her sister-in-law, pleading the difficulty she had in procuring breakfast for lodgers without any money for the baker. Margaret protested against these encroachments, but still the money would be forthcoming. Once, towards the end of February, Mrs Buggins seduced her lodger down into her parlour in the area, and Miss Mackenzie thought she perceived that something of the old servant's manners had returned to her. She was more respectful than she had been of late, and made no attempts at smart, ill-natured speeches. "It's a weary life, miss, this you're living here, isn't it?" said she. Margaret said that it was weary, but that there could be no change till the lawsuit should be settled. It would be settled, she hoped, in April. "Bother it for a lawsuit," said Mrs Buggins. "They all tells me that it ain't any lawsuit at all, really." "It's an amicable lawsuit," said Miss Mackenzie. "I never see such amicableness. 'Tis a wonder to hear, miss, how everybody is talking about it everywheres. Where we was last night, that is, Buggins and I, most respectable people in the copying line. It isn't only as he does the copying, but she too, nurses the baby and minds the kitchen fire, and goes on, sheet after sheet, all at the same time, and a very tidy thing they make of it, only they do straggle their words so. Well, they were saying as it's one of the most remarkablest cases as ever was knowed." "I don't see that I shall be any the better because it's talked about." "Well, Miss Margaret, I'm not so sure of that. It's my belief that if one only gets talked about enough, one may have a'most anything one chooses to ask for." "But I don't want to ask for anything." "But if what we heard last night is true, there's somebody else that does want to ask for something, or as has asked, as folks say." Margaret blushed up to her eyes, and then protested that she did not know what Mrs Buggins meant. "I never dreamed of it, my dear, indeed I didn't, when the old lady come here with her tantrums. But now it's as plain as a pikestaff. If I'd a known anything about that, my dear, I shouldn't have made so free about Buggins. Indeed I shouldn't." "You're talking nonsense, Mrs Buggins. Indeed you are." "They have the whole story all over the town, at any rate, and in the lane, and all about the courts. and they declare it don't matter a toss of a halfpenny which way the matter goes, as you're to become Lady Ball the very moment the case is settled." Miss Mackenzie protested that Mrs Buggins was a stupid woman, the stupidest woman she had ever heard or seen, and then hurried up into her own room to hug herself in her joy, and teach herself to believe that what so many people said must at last come true. 3 days after this, a very fine private carriage, with 2 servants on a hammer-cloth, drove up to the door in Arundel Street, and the maid-servant, hurrying upstairs, told Miss Mackenzie that a beautifully dressed lady downstairs was desirous of seeing her immediately. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Miss Mackenzie by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kirsten Wever. Chapter 26. Mrs. Mackenzie of Cavendish Square. "My dear," said the beautifully dressed lady, "you don't know me, I think?" And the beautifully dressed lady came up to Miss Mackenzie very cordially, took her by the hand, smiled upon her, and seemed to be a very good-natured person indeed. Margaret told the lady that she did not know her, and at that moment was altogether at a loss to guess who the lady might be. The lady might be 40 years of age, but was still handsome, and carried with her that easy, self-assured, well-balanced manner which, if it be not overdone, goes so far to make up for beauty, if beauty itself be wanting. "I am your cousin, Mrs. Mackenzie, Clara Mackenzie. My husband is Walter Mackenzie, and his father is Sir Walter Mackenzie of Incharo. Now you will know all about me." "Oh, yes, I know you," said Margaret. "I ought, I suppose, to make ever so many apologies for not coming to you before, but I did call upon you ever so long ago, I forget when, and after that you went to live at Littlebath. And then we heard of you as being with Lady Ball, and for some reason which I don't quite understand, it has always been supposed that Lady Ball and I were not to know each other. And now I have heard this wonderful story about your fortune, and about everything else too, my dear, and it seems all very beautiful and very romantic, and everybody says that you have behaved so well, and so, to make a long story short, I have come to find you out in your hermitage, and to claim cousinship, and all that sort of thing." "I'm sure I'm very much obliged to you, Mrs. Mackenzie." "Don't say it in that way, my dear, or else you'll make me think you mean to turn a cold shoulder on me for not coming to you before." "Oh, no." "But we've only just come to town, and though, of course, I heard the story down in Scotland—" "Did you?" "Did I? Why, everybody is talking about it, and the newspapers have been full of it." "Oh, Mrs. Mackenzie, that is so terrible." "But nobody has said a word against you. Even that stupid clergyman who calls you the lamb has not pretended to say that you were his lamb. We had the whole story of the Lion and the Lamb in the Inverary Interpreter, but I had no idea that it was you then. But the long and the short of it is that my husband says he must know his cousin, and to tell you the truth, it was he that sent me. And we want you to come and stay with us in Cavendish Square till the lawsuit is over and everything is settled." Margaret was so startled by the proposition that she did not know how to answer it. Of course she was at first impressed with a strong idea of the impossibility of her complying with such a request, and was simply anxious to find some proper way of refusing it. The Incharo Mackenzies were great people, who saw much company, and it was, she thought, quite out of the question that she should go to their house. At no time of her career would she have been, as she conceived, fit to live with such grand persons. But at the present moment, when she grudged herself even a new pair of gloves out of the money remaining to her, while she was still looking forward to a future life passed as a nurse in a hospital, She felt that there would be an absolute unfitness in such a visit. "You are very kind," she said at last, with faltering voice, as she meditated in what words she might best convey her refusal. "No, I'm not a bit kind, and I know from the tone of your voice that you are meditating a refusal. But I don't mean to accept it. It is much better that you should be with us while all this is going on, than that you should be living here alone. And there is no one with whom you could live during this time so properly as with those who are your nearest relatives." "But Mrs Mackenzie—" "I suppose you're thinking now of another cousin, but it's not at all proper that you should go to his house. Not as yet, you know. And you need not suppose that he'll object because of what I said about Lady Ball and myself. The Capulets and the Montagues don't intend to keep it up for ever, and though we have never visited Lady Ball, my husband and the present Sir John know each other very well." Mrs Mackenzie was not on that occasion able to persuade Margaret to come at once to Cavendish Square, and neither was Margaret able to give a final refusal. She did not intend to go, but she could not bring herself to speak a positive answer in such a way as to have much weight with Mrs Mackenzie. That lady left her at last, saying that she would send her husband, and promising Margaret that she would herself come in 10 days to fetch her. "Oh, no," said Margaret. "It will be very good-natured of you to come, but not for that." "But I shall come, and shall come for that," said Mrs Mackenzie. And at the end of 10 days she did come, and she did carry her husband's cousin back with her to Cavendish Square. In the meantime Walter Mackenzie had called in Arundel Street and had seen Margaret, but there had been given to her advice by a counsellor whom she was more inclined to obey than any of the Mackenzies. John Ball had written to her, saying that he had heard of the proposition, and recommending her to accept the invitation given to her. "Till all this trouble about the property is settled," said he, "it will be much better that you should be with your cousins than living alone in Mrs Buggins's lodgings." After receiving this, Margaret held out no longer, but was carried off by the handsome lady in the grand carriage, very much to the delight of Mrs Buggins. Mrs Buggins's respect for Miss Mackenzie had returned altogether since she had heard of the invitation to Cavendish Square, and she apologized, almost without ceasing, for the liberty she had taken in suggesting that Margaret should drink tea with her husband. "And indeed, miss, I shouldn't have proposed such a thing were it ever so, if I had suspected for a hinstant how things were going to be. For Buggins is a man as knows his place, and never puts himself beyond it. But you was that close, miss." In answer to this, Margaret would say that it didn't signify, and that it wasn't on that account, and I have no doubt but that the two women understood each other thoroughly. There was a subject on which, in spite of all her respect, Mrs Buggins ventured to give Miss Mackenzie much advice, and to insist on that advice strongly. Mrs Buggins was very anxious that the future baronet's lady should go out upon her grand visit with a proper assortment of clothing. That argument of the baronet's lady was the climax of Mrs Buggins's eloquence. "You, my dear, as is going to be one baronet's lady, is going to a lady who is going to be another baronet's lady, and it's only becoming you should go as is becoming." Margaret declared that she was not going to be anybody's lady, but Mrs Buggins altogether pooh-poohed this assertion. "That, miss, is your predestination," said Mrs Buggins, "and well you'll become it. And as for money, doesn't that old party who found it all out say reg'lar once a month that there's whatever you want to take for your own necessaries? And you that haven't had a shilling from him yet. If it was me, I'd send him in such a bill for necessaries as 'ud open up an old party's eyes a bit, and hurry him up with the lawsuits." The matter was at last compromised between her and Margaret, and a very moderate expenditure for smarter clothing was incurred. On the day appointed, Mrs Mackenzie came again, and Margaret was carried off to Cavendish Square. Here she found herself suddenly brought into a mode of life altogether different from anything she had as yet experienced. The Mackenzies were people who went much into society, and received company frequently at their own house. The first of these evils for a time Margaret succeeded in escaping, but from the latter she had no means of withdrawing herself. There was very much to astonish her at this period of her life, but that which astonished her perhaps more than anything else was her own celebrity. Everybody had heard of the Lion and the Lamb, and everybody was aware that she was supposed to represent the milder of these two favourite animals. Everybody knew the story of her property, or rather of the property which had never in truth been hers, and which was now being made to pass out of her hands by means of a lawsuit, of which everybody spoke as though it were the best thing in the world for all the parties concerned. People, when they mentioned Sir Ball to her, and he was so often mentioned, never spoke of him in harsh terms, as though he were her enemy. She observed that he was always named before her in that euphemistic language which we naturally use when we speak to persons of those who are nearest to them and dearest to them. The romance of the thing, and not the pity of it, was the general subject of discourse, so that she could not fail to perceive that she was generally regarded as the future wife of Sir John Ball. It was the sudden way in which all this had come upon her that affected her so greatly. While staying in Arundel Street she had been altogether ignorant that the story of the Lion and the Lamb had become public, or that her name had been frequent in men's mouths. When Mrs Buggins had once told her that she was thus becoming famous, she had ridiculed Mrs Buggins's statement. Mrs Buggins had brought home word from some tea party that the story had been discussed among her own friends, but Miss Mackenzie had regarded that as an accident. A lawyer's clerk or two about Chancery Lane or Carey Street might by chance hear of the matter in the course of their daily work. That it should be so, and that such people talked of her affairs, distressed her. But that had, she was sure, been all. Now, however, in her new home, she had learned that Mr Maguire's efforts had become notorious, and that she and her history were public property. When all this first became plain to her, it overwhelmed her so greatly that she was afraid to show her face. But this feeling gradually wore itself away, and she found herself able to look around upon the world again, and ask herself new questions of the future, as she had done when she had first found herself to be the possessor of her fortune. When she had been about 3 weeks with the Mackenzies, Sir John Ball came to see her. He had written to her once before that, but his letter had referred simply to some matter of business. When he was shown into the drawing-room in Cavendish Square, Mrs Mackenzie and Margaret were both there, but the former, in a few minutes, got up and left the room. Margaret had wished with all her heart that her hostess would remain with them. She was sure that Sir John Ball had nothing to say that she would care to hear, and his saying nothing would seem to be of no special moment while 3 persons were in the room. But his saying nothing, when special opportunity for speaking had been given to him, would be of moment to her. Her destiny was in his hands to such a degree that she felt his power over her to amount almost to a cruelty. She longed to ask him what her fate was to be, but it was a question that she could not put to him. She knew that he would not tell her now, and she knew also that the very fact of his not telling her would inflict upon her a new misery, and deprive her of the comfort which she was beginning to enjoy. If he could not tell her at once how all this was to be ended, it would be infinitely better for her that he should remain away from her altogether. As soon as Mrs Mackenzie had left the room, he began to describe to her his last interview with the lawyers. She listened to him and pretended to interest herself, but she did not care 2 straws about the lawyers. Point after point he explained to her, showing the unfortunate ingenuity with which his uncle Jonathan had contrived to confuse his affairs, and Margaret attempted to appear concerned. But her mind had now for some months past refused to exert itself with reference to the mode in which Mr. Jonathan Ball had disposed of his money. 2 years ago she had been told that it was hers. Since that she had been told that it was not hers. She had felt the hardship of this at first, but now that feeling was over with her, and she did not care to hear more about it. But she did care very much to know what was to be her future fate. "And when will be the end of it, John?" she asked him. "Ha! That seems to be so hard to say. They did name the 1st of April, but it won't be so soon as that. Mr. Slow said to-day about the end of April, but his clerk seems to think that it will be the middle of May." "It is very provoking," said Margaret. "Yes, it is," said John Ball. "Very provoking. I feel it so. It worries me so terribly that I have no comfort in life. But I suppose you find everything very nice here?" "They are very kind to me." "Very kind indeed. It was quite the proper thing for them to do. And when I heard that Mrs. Mackenzie had been to you in Arundel Street, I was delighted." Margaret did not dare to tell him that she would have preferred to have been left in Arundel Street, but that at the moment was her feeling. If, when all this was over, she would still have to earn her bread, it would have been much better for her not to have come among her rich relations. What good would it then do her to have lived 2 or 3 months in Cavendish Square? "I wish it were all settled, John," she said, and as she spoke there was a tear standing in the corner of each eye. "I wish it were indeed," said John Ball, but I think that he did not see the tears. It was on her tongue to speak some word about the hospital, but she felt that if she did so now, it would be tantamount to asking him that question which it did not become her to ask. So she repressed the word, and sat in silence. "When the day is positively fixed for the hearing," said he, "I will be sure to let you know." "I wish you would let me know nothing further about it, John, till it is all settled." "I sometimes almost fancy that I wish the same thing," said he, with a faint attempt at a smile. And after that he got up and went his way. This was not to be endured. Margaret declared to herself that she could not live and bear it. Let the people around her say what they would, it could not be that he would treat her in this way if he intended to make her his wife. It would be better for her to make up her mind that it was not to be so, and to insist on leaving the Mackenzies' house. She would go, not again to Arundel Street, but to some lodging further away, in some furthest recess of London, where no one would come to her and flurry her with false hopes, and there remain till she might be allowed to earn her bread. That was the mood in which Mrs. Mackenzie found her late in the afternoon on the day of Sir Ball's visit. There was to be a dinner party in the house that evening, and Margaret began by asking leave to absent herself. "Nonsense, Margaret," said Mrs. Mackenzie. "I won't have anything of that kind." "I cannot come down, Mrs. Mackenzie. I cannot indeed." "That is absolute nonsense. The man has been saying something unkind to you. Why do you mind what he says?" "He has not said anything unkind. He has not said anything at all." "Ah, that's the grief, is it?" "I don't know what you mean by grief, but if you were situated as I am, you would perceive that you were in a false position." "I am sure he has been saying something unkind to you." Margaret hardly knew how to tell her thoughts and feelings, and yet she wished to tell them. She had resolved that she would tell the whole to Mrs. Mackenzie, having convinced herself that she could not carry out her plan of leaving Cavendish Square without some explanation of the kind. She did not know how to make her speech with propriety, so she jumped at the difficulty boldly. "The truth is, Mrs. Mackenzie, that he has no more idea of marrying me than he has of marrying you." Margaret, how can you talk such nonsense?" "It is not nonsense. It is true. And it will be much better that it should all be understood at once. I have nothing to blame him for, nothing. And I don't blame him. But I cannot bear this kind of life any longer. It is killing me. What business have I to be living here in this way, when I have got nothing of my own, and have no one to depend on but myself?" "Then he must have said something to you, but whatever it was, you cannot but have misunderstood him." "No, he has said nothing, and I have not misunderstood him." Then there was a pause. "He has said nothing to me, and I am bound to understand what that means." "Margaret, I want to put one question to you," said Mrs Mackenzie, speaking with a serious air that was very unusual with her. "And you will understand, dear, that I only do so because of what you are saying now." "You may put any question you please to me," said Margaret. "Has your cousin ever asked you to be his wife, or has he not?" "Yes, he has. He has asked me twice." "And what answer did you make him?" "When I thought all the property was mine, I refused him. Then, when the property became his, he asked me again, and I accepted him. Sometimes, when I think of that, I feel so ashamed of myself that I hardly dare to hold up my head." "But you did not accept him simply because you had lost your money?" "No, but it looks so like it, does it not? And of course he must think that I did so." "I am quite sure he thinks nothing of the kind. But he did ask you, and you did accept him?" "Oh, yes." "And since that, has he ever said anything to you to signify that the match should be broken off?" "The very day after he had asked me, Mr Maguire came to the Suitors and saw me, and Lady Ball was there too, and he was very false, and told my aunt things that were altogether untrue. He said that I had promised to marry him, and Lady Ball believed him." "But did Mr Ball believe him?" "My aunt said all that she could against me, and when John spoke to me the next day, it was clear that he was very angry with me." "But did he believe you or Mr Maguire when you told him that Mr Maguire's story was a falsehood from beginning to end?" "But it was not a falsehood from beginning to end. That's where I have been so very, very unfortunate. And perhaps I ought to say, as I don't want to hide anything from you, so very, very wrong. The man did ask me to marry him, and I had given him no answer." "Had you thought of accepting him?" "I had not thought about that at all when he came to me, so I told him that I would consider it all, and that he must come again." "And he came again?" "Then my brother's illness occurred, and I went to London. After that Mr Maguire wrote to me 2 or 3 times, and I refused him in the plainest language that I could use. I told him that I had lost all my fortune, and then I was sure that there would be an end of any trouble from him. But he came to the Cedars on purpose to do me all this injury, and now he has put all these stories about me into the newspapers. How can I think that any man would like to make me his wife? I have no right to be surprised that Lady Ball should be so eager against it." "But did Mr Ball believe you when you told him the story?" "I think he did believe me." "And what did he say?" Margaret did not answer at once, but sat with her fingers up among her hair upon her brow. "I am trying to think what were his words," she said, "but I cannot remember. I spoke more than he did. He said that I should have told him about Mr Maguire, and I tried to explain to him that there had been no time to do so. Then I said that he could leave me if he liked." "And what did he answer?" "If I remember rightly, he made no answer. He left me, saying that he would see me again the next day, but the next day I went away. I would not remain in the house with Lady Ball after what she had believed about me. She took that other man's part against me, and therefore I went away." "Did he say anything as to your going?" "He begged me to stay, but I would not stay. I thought it was all over then. I regarded him as being quite free from any engagement, and myself as being free from any necessity of obeying him. And it was all over. I had no right to think anything else. And what came next? Nothing. Nothing else has happened, except that Lady Ball came to me in Arundel Street, asking me to renounce him. And you refused? Yes. I would do nothing at her bidding. Why should I? She had been my enemy throughout, since she found that the money belonged to her son and not to me. And all this time you have seen him frequently? I have seen him sometimes about the business. And he has never said a word to you about your engagement to him? Never a word. Nor you to him? Oh, no. How could I speak to him about it? I would have done so. I would not have had my heart crushed within me. But perhaps you were right. Perhaps it was best to be patient. I know that I have been very wrong to expect anything or to hope for anything, said Margaret. What right have I to hope for anything when I refused him while I was rich? That has nothing to do with it. When he asked me again, he only did it because he pitied me. I don't want to be any man's wife because he pities me. But you accepted him. Yes, because I loved him. And now? Again Miss Mackenzie sat silent, still moving her fingers among her locks upon her brow. And now, Margaret, repeated Mrs. Mackenzie. What's the use of it now? But you do love him? Of course I love him. How shall it be otherwise? What has he done to change my love? His feelings have changed, and I have no right to blame him. He has changed, and I hate myself because I feel that in coming here I have, as it were, run after him. I should have put myself in some place where no thought of marrying him should ever have come again to me. Margaret, you are wrong throughout. Am I? Everybody always says that I am wrong. If I can understand anything of the matter, Sir John Ball has not changed. Then why? Ah, yes, exactly, why? Why is it that men and women cannot always understand each other, that they will remain for hours in each other's presence without the power of expressing by a single word the thoughts that are busy within them? Who can say why it is so? Can you get up and make a clean breast of it all to him? But I am a woman, and am very poor. Yes, and he is a man, and, like most men, very dumb when they have anything at heart which requires care in the speaking. He knows no better than to let things be as they are, to leave the words all unspoken till he can say to you, now is the time for us to go and get ourselves married, just as he might tell you that now was the time to go out and dine. But will he ever say that? Of course he will. If he does not say so when all this business is off his mind, when Mr. Maguire and his charges are put at rest, when the lawyers have finished their work, then come to me and tell me that I have deceived you. Say to me then, Clara Mackenzie, you have put me wrong, and I look to you to put me right. You will find I will put you right. In answer to this, Margaret was able to say nothing further. She sat for a while, with her face buried in her hands, thinking of it all, asking herself whether she might dare to believe it all. At last, however, she went up to dress for dinner, and when she came down to the drawing-room there was a smile upon her face. After that a month or 6 weeks passed in Cavendish Square, and there was during all that time no further special reference to Sir John Ball or his affairs. Twice he was asked to dine with the Mackenzies, and on both occasions he did so. On neither of those evenings did he say very much to Margaret, but on both of them he said some few words, and it was manifestly his desire that they should be regarded as friends. And as the spring came on, Margaret's patience returned to her, and her spirits were higher than they had been at any time since she first discovered that success among the Stumfoldians at Littlebath did not make her happy. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Miss Mackenzie by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kirsten Wever. Chapter 27. The Negro Soldiers' Orphan Bazaar. In the spring days of the early May, there came up in London that year a great bazaar, a great charity bazaar, on behalf of the orphan children of Negro soldiers who had fallen in the American War. Tidings had come to this country that all slaves taken in the revolted states had been made free by the northern invaders, and that these free men had been called upon to show their immediate gratitude by becoming soldiers in the northern ranks. As soldiers, they were killed in battle or died, and as dead men they left orphans behind them. Information had come that many of these orphans were starving, and hence had arisen the cause for the Negro Soldiers' Orphan Bazaar. There was still in existence at that time, down at South Kensington, some remaining court or outstanding building which had belonged to the great international exhibition, and here the bazaar was to be held. I do not know that I can trace the way in which the idea grew and became great, or that anyone at the time was able to attribute the honour to the proper founder. Some gave it all to the Prince of Wales, declaring that His Royal Highness had done it out of his own head, and others were sure that the whole business had originated with a certain philanthropical Mr. Manfred Smith, who had lately come up in the world, and was supposed to have a great deal to do with most things. Be that as it may, this thing did grow and become great, and there was a list of lady patronesses which included some duchesses, one marchioness, and half the countesses in London. It was soon manifest to the eyes of those who understood such things that the Negro Soldiers' Orphan Bazaar was to be a success, and therefore there was no difficulty whatsoever in putting the custody of the stalls into the hands of proper persons. The difficulty consisted in rejecting offers from persons who undoubtedly were quite proper for such an occasion. There came to be interest made for permission to serve, and boastings were heard of unparalleled success in the bazaar line. The Duchess of St. Bungay had a happy bevy of young ladies, who were to act as counter-attendants under her Grace, and who so happy as any young lady who could get herself put upon the Duchess's staff. It was even rumoured that a certain very distinguished person would have shown herself behind a stall, had not a certain other more distinguished person expressed an objection. And while the rumour was afloat as to the junior of these two distinguished persons, the young ladydom of London was frantic in its eagerness to officiate. Now at that time there had become attached to the name of our poor Griselda a romance with which the West End of London had become wonderfully well acquainted. The story of the Lion and the Lamb was very popular. Mr. Maguire may be said to have made himself odious to the fashionable world at large, and the fate of poor Margaret Mackenzie, with her lost fortune, and the additional misfortune of her clerical pledged protector, had recommended itself as being truly interesting to all the feeling hearts of the season. Before May was over, gentlemen were enticed to dinner parties by being told, and untruly told, that the Lamb had been secured, as on the previous year they had been enticed by a singular assurance as to Bishop Colenso. And when Margaret on one occasion allowed herself to be taken to Covent Garden Theatre, every face from the stalls was turned towards her between acts. Who, then, was more fit to take a stall, or part of a stall, at the Negro Soldiers' Orphan Bazaar than our Griselda? When the thing loomed so large, lady patronesses began to be aware that mere nobodies would hardly be fit for the work. There would have been little or no difficulty in carrying out a law that nobody should take a part in the business who had not some handle to her name, But it was felt that such an arrangement as that might lead to failure rather than glory. The commoner world must be represented, but it should be represented only by ladies who had made great names for themselves. Mrs. Conway Sparkes, the spiteful poetess, though she was old and ugly as well as spiteful, was to have a stall and a bevy, because there was thought to be no doubt about her poetry. Mrs. Chaucer Munro had a stall and a bevy, but I cannot clearly tell her claim to distinction, unless it was that she had all but lost her character 4 times, but had so saved it on each of those occasions that she was just not put into the index expurgatorius of fashionable society in London. It was generally said by those young men who discussed the subject that among Mrs. Chaucer Munro's bevy would be found the most lucrative fascination of the day. And then Mrs. Mackenzie was asked to take a stall, or part of a stall, and to bring Griselda with her as her assistant. By this time the lamb was most generally known as Griselda among fashionable people. Now Mrs. Mackenzie was herself a woman of fashion, and quite open to the distinction of having a part assigned to her at the great bazaar of the season. She did not at all object to a booth on the left hand of the Duchess of St. Bungay, although it was just opposite to Mrs. Chaucer Munro. She assented at once. "But you must positively bring Griselda," said Lady Glencora Palliser, by whom the business of this mission was conducted. "Of course I understand that," said Mrs. Mackenzie, "but what if she won't come?" "Griseldas are made to do anything," said Lady Glencora, "and of course she must come." Having settled the difficulty in this way, Lady Glencora went her way, and Mrs. Mackenzie did not allow Griselda to go to her rest that night till she had extracted from her a promise of acquiescence, which, I think, never would have been given had Miss Mackenzie understood anything of the circumstances under which her presence was desired. But the promise was given, and Margaret knew little or nothing of what was expected from her till there came up, about a fortnight before the day of the bazaar, the great question of her dress for the occasion. Previous to that she would have feigned to be energetic in collecting and making things for sale at her stall, for she really taught herself to be anxious that the negro soldiers' orphans should have provisions made for them. But, alas, her energy was all repressed, and she found that she was not to be allowed to do anything in that direction. "Things of that sort would not go down at all nowadays, Margaret," said Mrs. Mackenzie. "Nobody would trouble themselves to carry them away. There are tradesmen who furnish the stalls, and mark their own prices, and take back what is not sold. You charge double the tradesman's price. That's all." Margaret, when her eyes were thus opened, of course ceased to make little pincushions, but she felt that her interest in the thing was very much lowered. But a word must be said as to that question of the dress. Miss Mackenzie, when she first was interrogated as to her intentions, declared her purpose of wearing a certain black silk dress which had seen every party at Mrs. Stumfold's during Margaret's Littlebath season. To this her cousin demurred, and from demurring proceeded to the enunciation of a positive order. The black silk dress in question should not be worn. Now Miss Mackenzie chose to be still in mourning on the 2nd of June, the day of the bazaar, her brother having died in September, and had no fitting garment, so she said, other than the black silk in question. Whereupon Mrs. Mackenzie, without further speech to her cousin on the subject, went out and purchased a muslin covered all over with the prettiest little flecks of black, and sent a milliner to Margaret, and provided a bonnet of much the same pattern, the gayest, lightest, jauntiest, falsest, most make-believe morning bonnet that ever sprang from the art of a designer in bonnets, and thus nearly broke poor Margaret's heart. "People should never have things given to them who can't buy for themselves," she said with tears in her eyes, "because of course they know what it means." "But, my dearest," said Mrs Mackenzie, "young ladies who never have any money of their own at all always accept presents from all their relations. It is their special privilege." "Oh yes, young ladies, but not women like me, who are waiting to find out whether they are ruined or not." The difficulty, however, was at last overcome, and Margaret, with many inward upbraidings of her conscience, consented to wear the black freckled dress. "I never saw anybody look so altered in my life," said Mrs Mackenzie, when Margaret, apparelled, appeared in the Cavendish Square drawing-room on the morning in question. "Oh dear, I hope Sir John Ball will come to look at you." "Nonsense. He won't be such a fool as to do anything of the kind." "I took care to let him know that you would be there," said Mrs Mackenzie. "You didn't." "But I did, my dear." "Oh dear, what will he think of me?" ejaculated Margaret. But nevertheless I fancy that there must have been some elation in her bosom when she regarded herself and the freckled muslin in the glass. Both Mrs Mackenzie and Miss Mackenzie had more than once gone down to the place to inspect the ground and make themselves familiar with the position they were to take. There were great stalls and little stalls, which came alternately, and the Mackenzie stall stood next to a huge centre booth at which the Duchess was to preside. On the other hand was the stall of old Lady Ware, and opposite to them, as has been before said, the doubtful Mrs Chaucer Munro was to hold difficult sway over her bevy of loud nymphs. Together with Mrs Mackenzie were two other Miss Mackenzies, sisters of her husband, handsome middle-aged women with high cheekbones and fine brave-looking eyes. All the Mackenzies, except our Griselda, were dressed in the tartan of their clan, and over the stall there was some motto in Gaelic, "Dhu da haith Donald da Huth," which nobody could understand, but which was not the less expressive. Indeed, the Mackenzie stall was got up very well. But then, was it not known and understood that Mrs Mackenzie did get up things very well? It was acknowledged on all sides that the lamb, Griselda, was uncommonly well got up on this occasion. It was understood that the ladies were to be assembled in the bazaar at 2:30, and that the doors were to be thrown open to the public at 3 o'clock. Soon after 2:30, Mrs Mackenzie's carriage was at the door, and the other Mackenzies having come up at the same time, the Mackenzie phalanx entered the building together. There were many others with them, but as they walked up they found the Countess of Ware standing alone in the centre of the building, with her 4 daughters behind her. She had on her head a wonderful tiara, which gave to her appearance a ferocity almost greater than was natural to her. She was a woman with square jaws and a big face and stout shoulders, but she was not, of her own unassisted height, very tall. But of the tiara and its altitude she was proud, and as she stood in the middle of the stalls, brandishing her umbrella-sized parasol in her anger, the ladies, as they entered, might well be cowed by her presence. "When ladies say 2:30, said she, "they ought to come at 2:30. Where is the Duchess of St. Bungay? I shall not wait for her." But there was a lady there who had come in behind the Mackenzies, whom nothing ever cowed. This was the Lady Glencora Palliser, the great heiress who had married the heir of a great duke, pretty, saucy, and occasionally intemperate, in whose eyes Lady Ware, with her ferocious tiara, was simply an old woman in a ridiculous headgear. The Countess had apparently addressed herself to Mrs Mackenzie, who had been the foremost to enter the building, and our Margaret had already begun to tremble. But Lady Glencora stepped forward and took the brunt of the battle upon herself. "Nobody ever yet was so punctual as my Lady Ware," said Lady Glencora. "It is very annoying to be kept waiting on such occasions," said the Countess. "But, my dear Lady Ware, who keeps you waiting? There is your stall, and why on earth should you stand here and call us all over as we come in, like naughty schoolboys?" "The Duchess said expressly that she should be here at 2:30. "Who ever expects the dear Duchess to keep her word?" said Lady Glencora. "Or who ever cared whether she does or does not?" said Mrs. Chaucer Munro, who, with her peculiar bevy, had now made her way up among the front rank. Then to have seen the tiara of Lady Ware, as it wagged and nodded while she looked at Mrs. Munro, and to have witnessed the high moral tone of the ferocity with which she stalked away to her own stall with her daughters behind her, a tragic comedy which it was given to no male eyes to behold, would have been worth the whole after-performance of the bazaar. No male eyes beheld that scene, as Mr. Manfred Smith, the manager, had gone out to look for his Duchess, and, missing her carriage in the crowd, did not return till the bazaar had been opened. That Mrs. Chaucer Munro did not sink, collapse among her bevy, must have been owing altogether to that callousness which a long habit of endurance produces. Probably she did feel something, as at the moment there came no titter from any other bevy corresponding to the titter which was raised by her own. She and her bevy retired to their allotted place, conscious that their time for glory could not come till the male world should appear upon the scene. But Lady Ware's tiara still wagged and nodded behind her counter, and Margaret, looking at her, thought that she must have come there as the grand duenna of the occasion. Just at 3 o'clock the poor Duchess hurried into the building in a terrible flurry, and went hither and thither among the stalls, not knowing at first where was her throne. Unkind chance threw her at first almost into the booth of Mrs. Conway Sparkes, the woman whom of all women she hated the most, and from thence she recoiled into the arms of Lady Hartletop, who was sitting serene, placid, and contented in her appointed place. "Opposite, I think, Duchess," Mrs. Conway Sparkes had said. "We are only the very small fry here." "Oh, I beg pardon. They told me the middle to the left." "And this is the middle to the right," said Mrs. Conway Sparkes. But the Duchess had turned round since she came in, and could not at all understand where she was. "Under the canopy, Duchess," just whispered Lady Hartletop. Lady Hartletop was a young woman who knew her right hand from her left under all circumstances of life, and who never made any mistakes. The Duchess looked up in her confusion to the centre of the ceiling, but could see no canopy. Lady Hartletop had done all that could be required of her, and if the Duchess were to die amidst her difficulties, it would not be her fault. Then came forth the Lady Glencora, and with true charity conducted the Lady President to her chair, just in time to avoid the crush which ensued upon the opening of the doors. The doors were opened, and very speedily the space of the bazaar between the stalls became too crowded to have admitted the safe passage of such a woman as the Duchess of St. Bungay. But Lady Glencora, who was less majestic in her size and gait, did not find herself embarrassed. And now there arose, before the general work of fleecing the weather lambs had well commenced, a terrible discord, as of a brass band with broken bassoons and trumpets all out of order, from the further end of the building, a terrible noise of most unmusical music, such as Bartholomew Fair in its loudest days could hardly have known. At such a diapason one would have thought that the tender ears of Mayfair and Belgravia would have been crushed and cracked and riven asunder, that female voices would have shrieked, and the intensity of fashionable female agony would have displayed itself in all its best recognized forms. But the crash of brass was borne by them as though they had been rough schoolboys delighting in a din. The Duchess gave one jump, and then remained quiet and undismayed. If Lady Hartletop heard it, she did not betray the hearing. Lady Glencora for a moment put her hands to her ears as she laughed, but she did it as though the prettiness of the motion were its only one cause. The fine nerves of Mrs. Conway Sparkes, the poetess, bore it all without flinching, and Mrs. Chaucer Munro with her bevy rushed forward so that they might not lose anything of what was coming. "What are they going to do?" said Margaret to her cousin, in alarm. "It's the play part of the thing. Have you not seen the bills?" Then Margaret looked at a great placard which was exhibited near to her, which, though by no means intelligible to her, gave her to understand that there was a show in progress. The wit of the thing seemed to consist chiefly in the wonderful names chosen. The King of the Cannibal Islands was to appear on a white charger. King Chrononhotonthologos was to be led in chains by Tom Thumb. Achilles would drag Hector thrice round the walls of Troy, and Queen Godiva would ride through Coventry, accompanied by Lord Burghley and the ambassador from Japan. It was also signified that in some back part of the premises a theatrical entertainment would be carried on throughout the afternoon, the King of the Cannibal Islands, with his royal brother and sister, Chrononhotonthologos and Godiva, taking principal parts. But as nobody seemed to go to the theatre, the performers spent their time chiefly in making processions through and amidst the stalls, when, as the day waxed hot and the work became heavy, they seemed to be taken much in dudgeon by the various bevies with whose business they interfered materially. On this, their opening march, they rushed into the bazaar with great energy, and though they bore no resemblance to the characters named in the playbill, and though there was among them neither a Godiva, a Hector, a Tom Thumb, or a Japanese, nevertheless, as they were dressed in paint and armour after the manner of the late Mr. Richardson's heroes, and as most of the ladies had probably been without previous opportunity of seeing such delights, they had their effect. When they had made their 21st procession, the thing certainly grew stale, and as they brought with them an infinity of dirt, they were no doubt a nuisance. But no one would have been inclined to judge these amateur actors with harshness who knew how much they themselves were called on to endure, who could appreciate the disgusting misery of a hot summer afternoon spent beneath dust and paint and tin-plate armour, and who would remember that the performers received payment neither in éclat, nor in thanks, nor even in the smiles of beauty. "Can't somebody tell them not to come any more?" said the Duchess, almost crying with vexation towards the end of the afternoon. Then Mr. Manfred Smith, who managed everything, went to the rear, and the king and warriors were sent away to get beer or cooling drinks at their respective clubs. Poor Mr. Manfred Smith! He had not been present at the moment in which he was wanted to lead the Duchess to her stall, and the Duchess never forgave him. Instead of calling him by his name from time to time, and enabling him to shine in public as he deserved to shine, for he had worked at the bazaar for the last 6 weeks as no professional man ever worked at his profession, the Duchess always asked for somebody when she wanted Mr. Smith, and treated him, when he came, as though he had been a servant hired for the occasion. One very difficult job of work was given to him before the day was done. "I wish you'd go over to those young women," said the Duchess, "and say that if they make so much noise, I must go away." The young women in question were Mrs. Chaucer Munro and her bevy, and the commission was one which poor Mr. Manfred Smith found it difficult to execute. "Mrs. Munro," said he, "you'll be sorry to hear that the Duchess has got a headache, and she thinks we might all be a little quieter." The shouts of the loud nymphs were by this time high. "Pooh!" said one of them. "Headache, indeed!" said another. "Bother her head!" said a third. "If the Duchess is ill, perhaps she had better retire," said Mrs. Chaucer Munro. Then Mr. Manfred Smith walked off sorrowfully toward the door, and seating himself on the stool of the money-taker by the entrance, wiped off the perspiration from his brow. He had already put on his third pair of yellow kid gloves for the occasion, and they were soiled and torn and disreputable. His polished boots were brown with dust. The magenta ribbon round his neck had become a moist rope. His hat had been thrown down and rumpled. A drop of oil had made a spot upon his trousers. His whiskers were draggled and out of order, and his mouth was full of dirt. I doubt if Mr. Manfred Smith will ever undertake to manage another bazaar. The Duchess, I think, was right in her endeavour to mitigate the riot among Mrs. Munro's nymphs. Indeed, there was rioting among other nymphs than hers, though her noise and their noise was the loudest, and it was difficult to say how there should not be riot, seeing what was to be the recognized manner of transacting business. At first there was something of prettiness in the rioting. The girls who went about among the crowd, begging men to put their hands into lucky bags, trading in rosebuds, and asking for half-crowns for cigar-lighters, were fresh in their muslins, pretty with their braided locks, and perhaps not impudently over-pressing in their solicitations to male strangers. While they were not as yet either aweary or habituated to the necessity of importunity, they remembered their girlhood and their ladyhood, their youth and their modesty, and still carried with them something of the bashfulness of maidenhood. And the young men, the weather lambs, were as yet flush with their half-crowns, and the elder sheep had not quite dispensed the last of their sovereigns, or buttoned up their trouser pockets. But as the work went on, and the dust arose, and the prettinesses were destroyed, and money became scarce, and weariness was felt, and the heat showed itself, and the muslins sank into limpness, and the ribbons lost their freshness, and braids of hair grew rough and loose, and sidelocks displaced themselves. As girls became used to soliciting, and forgetful of their usual reticences in their anxiety for money, the charm of the thing went, and all was ugliness and rapacity. Young ladies no longer moved about doing works of charity, but harpies and unclean birds were greedy in quest of their prey. "Put a letter in my post-office," said one of Mrs. Munro's bevy, who officiated in a postal capacity behind a little square hole, to a young man on whom she pounced out and had caught him and brought up almost with violence. The young man tendered some scrap of paper and a sixpence. "Only sixpence," said the girl. A cabman could not have made the complaint with more finished accent of rapacious disgust. "Never mind," said the girl, "I'll give you an answer." Then, with inky fingers and dirty hands, she tendered him some scrawl, and demanded 5 shillings postage. "5 shillings!" said the young man. "Oh, I'm d—d." Then he gave her a shilling and walked away. She ventured to give one little halloa after him, but she caught the Duchess's eye looking at her, and was quiet. I don't think there was much real flirting done. Men won't flirt with draggled girls, smirched with dust, weary with work, and soiled with heat, and especially they will not do so at the rate of a shilling a word. When the whole thing was over, Mrs. Chaucer Munro's bevy, lying about on the benches in fatigue before they went away, declared that, as far as they were concerned, the thing was a mistake. The expenditure in gloves and muslin had been considerable, and the returns to them had been very small. It is not only that men will not flirt with draggled girls, but they will carry away with them unfortunate remembrances of what they have seen and heard. Upon the whole, it may be doubted whether any of the bevies were altogether contented with the operations on the occasion of the Negro Soldiers' Orphan Bazaar. Miss Mackenzie had been, perhaps, more fortunate than some of the others. It must, however, be remembered that there are two modes of conducting business at these bazaars. There is the travelling merchant who roams about, and there is the stationary merchant who remains always behind her counter. It is not to be supposed that the Duchess of St. Bungay spent the afternoon rushing about with a lucky bag. The Duchess was a stationary trader, and so were all the ladies who belonged to the Mackenzie booth. Miss Mackenzie, the lamb, had been much regarded, and consequently the things at her disposal had been quickly sold. It had all seemed to her to be very wonderful, and as the fun grew fast and furious, as the young girls became eager in their attacks, she made up her mind that she would never occupy another stall at a bazaar. One incident, and but one, occurred to her during the day, and one person came to her that she knew, and but one. It was nearly 6, and she was beginning to think that the weary work must soon be over, when, on a sudden, she found Sir John Ball standing beside her. "Oh, John," she said, startled by his presence, "who would have thought of seeing you here?" "And why not me as well as any other fool of my age?" "Because you think it foolish," she answered, "and I suppose the others don't." "Why should you say that I think it foolish? At any rate, I'm glad to see you looking so nice and happy." "I don't know about being happy," said Margaret, "or nice either, for the matter of that." But there was a smile on her face as she spoke, and Sir John smiled also when he saw it. "Doesn't she look well in that bonnet?" said Mrs. Mackenzie, turning round to the side of the counter at which he was standing. "It was my choice, and I absolutely made her wear it. If you knew the trouble I had." "It is very pretty," said Sir John. "Is it not? And are you not very much obliged to me? I'm sure you ought to be, for nobody before has ever taken the trouble of finding out what becomes her most. As for herself, she's much too well-behaved a young woman to think of such vanities." "Not at present, certainly," said Margaret. "And why not at present? She looks on those lawyers and their work as though there were something funereal about them. You ought to teach her better, Sir John." "All that will be over in a day or two now," said he. "And then she will shake off her dowdiness and her gloom altogether," said Mrs. Mackenzie. "Do you know, I fancy she has a liking for pretty things at heart as well as another woman." "I hope she has." "Of course you do. What is a woman worth without it? Don't be angry, Margaret, but I say a woman is worth nothing without it, and Sir John will agree with me if he knows anything about the matter. But, Margaret, why don't you make him buy something? He can't refuse you if you ask him." If Miss Mackenzie could thereby have provided for all the Negro soldiers' orphans in existence, I do not think that she could at that moment have solicited him to make a purchase. "Come, Sir John," continued Mrs. Mackenzie, "you must buy something of her. What do you say to this paper knife?" "How much does the paper knife cost?" said he, smiling. It was a large, elaborate, and perhaps I may say unwieldy affair, with a great elephant at the end of it. "Oh, that is terribly dear," said Margaret. "It costs £2.10. Thereupon he put his hand into his pocket, and taking out his purse, gave her a £5 note. "We never give change," said Mrs. Mackenzie. "Do we, Margaret?" "I'll give him change," said Margaret. "I'll be extravagant for once," said Sir John, "and let you keep the whole." "Oh, John," said Margaret. "You have no right to scold him yet," said Mrs. Mackenzie. Margaret, when she heard this, blushed up to her forehead, and in her confusion forgot all about the paper knife and the money. Sir John, I fancy, was almost as much confused himself, and was quite unable to make any fitting reply. But just at that moment there came across 2 harpies from the realms of Mrs. Chaucer Munro, eagerly intent upon their prey. "Here are the lion and the lamb together," said one harpy. "The lion must buy a rose to give to the lamb. Sir Lion, the rose is but a poor half-crown." And she tendered him a battered flower, leering at him from beneath her draggled, dusty bonnet, as she put forth her untempting hand for the money. Sir Lion, said the other harpy, "I want your name for a raffle." But the lion was off, having pushed the first harpy aside somewhat rudely. That tale of the Lion and the Lamb had been very terrible to him, but never till this occasion had any one dared to speak of it directly to his face. But what will not a harpy do who has become wild and dirty and disgusting in the pursuit of half-crowns? "Now he is angry," said Margaret. "Oh, Mrs. Mackenzie, why did you say that?" "Yes, he is angry," said Mrs. Mackenzie, "but not with you or me. Upon my word, I thought he would have pushed that girl over, and if he had, he would only have served her right." "But why did you say that? You shouldn't have said it." "About your not scolding him yet? I said it, my dear, because I wanted to make myself certain. I was almost certain before, but now I am quite certain." "Certain of what, Mrs. Mackenzie?" "That you'll be a baronet's wife before me, and entitled to be taken out of a room first, as long as dear old Sir Walter is alive." Soon after that the bazaar was brought to an end, and it was supposed to have been the most successful thing of the kind ever done in London. Loud boasts were made that more than £800 had been cleared, but whether any orphans of any negro soldiers were ever the better for the money, I am not able to say. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Miss Mackenzie, by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kirsten Wever. Chapter 28. Showing how the lion was stung by the wasp. It may be remembered that Mr. Maguire, when he first made public that pretty story of the Lion and the Lamb, declared that he would give the lion no peace till that beast had disgorged his prey, and that he had pledged himself to continue the fight till he should have succeeded in bringing the lamb back to the pleasant pastures of Littlebath. But Mr. Maguire found some difficulty in carrying out his pledge. He was willing enough to fight, but the weapons with which to do battle were wanting to him. The Christian Examiner, having got so far into the mess, and finding that a ready sale did in truth result from any special article as to the Lion and the Lamb, was indeed ready to go on with the libel. The Christian Examiner probably had not much to lose. But there arose a question whether fighting simply through the columns of the Christian Examiner was not almost tantamount to no fight at all. He wanted to bring an action against Sir John Ball, and to have Sir John Ball summoned into court and examined about the money, to hear some truculent barrister tell Sir John Ball that he could not conceal himself from the scorn of an indignant public behind the spangles of his parvenu baronetcy. He had a feeling that the lion would be torn to pieces if only a properly truculent barrister could be got to fix his claws into him. But unfortunately no lawyer, not even Solomon Walker, the Low Church attorney at Littlebath, would advise him that he had any ground for an action. If, indeed, he chose to proceed against the lady for a breach of promise of marriage, then the result would depend on the evidence. In such case as that, the Low Church attorney at Littlebath was willing to take the matter up. But Mr. Maguire was, of course, aware, said Solomon Walker, that there was a prejudice in the public mind against gentlemen appearing as parties to such suits. Mr Maguire was also aware that he could adduce no evidence of the fact beyond his own unsupported, and in such case untrue, word, and declared therefore to the attorney, in a very high tone indeed, that on no account would he take any step to harass the lady. It was simply against Sir John Ball that he wished to proceed. "Things would come out in that trial, Mr Walker," he said, "which would astonish you and all the legal world. A rapacious scheme of villainy has been conceived and brought to bear, through the stupidity of some people and the iniquity of others, which would unroll itself fold by fold as certainly as I stand here, if it were properly handled by a competent barrister in one of our courts of law." And I think that Mr Maguire believed what he was saying, and that he believed, moreover, that he was speaking the truth when he told Mr Walker that the lady had promised to marry him. Men who can succeed in deceiving no one else will succeed at last in deceiving themselves. But the lawyer told him, repeating the fact over and over again, that the thing was impracticable, that there was no means of carrying the matter so far that Sir John Ball should be made to appear in a witness box. Everything that Sir John had done, he had done legally, and even at that moment of the discussion between Mr Walker and Mr Maguire, the question of the ownership of the property was being tried before a proper tribunal in London. Mr Maguire still thought Mr Walker to be wrong, thought that his attorney was a weak and ignorant man, but he acknowledged to himself the fact that he, in his unhappy position, was unable to get any more cunning attorney to take the matter in hand. But the Christian Examiner still remained to him, and that he used with diligence. From week to week there appeared in it articles attacking the lion, stating that the lion was still being watched, that his prey would be snatched from him at last, that the lamb should even yet have her rights, and the like. And as the thing went on, the periodical itself and the writer of the article became courageous by habit, till things were printed which Sir John Ball found it almost impossible to bear. It was declared that he was going to desert the lamb, now that he had taken all the lamb's property, and that the lamb, shorn of all her fleece, was to be condemned to earn her bread as a common nurse in the wards of a common hospital. All which information came readily enough to Mr Maguire by the hands of Miss Colza. The papers containing these articles were always sent to Sir John Ball and to Miss Mackenzie, and the articles were always headed "The Lion and the Lamb." Miss Mackenzie, in accordance with an arrangement made to that purpose, sent the papers as soon as they came to Mr Slow, but Sir John Ball had no such ready way of freeing himself from their burden. He groaned and toiled under them, going to his lawyer with them, and imploring permission to bring an action for libel against Mr Maguire. The venom of the unclean animal's sting had gone so deep into him that, fond as he was of money, he had told his lawyer that he would not begrudge the expense if he could only punish the man who was hurting him. But the attorney, who understood something of feeling as well as something of money, begged him to be quiet, at any rate till the fate of the property should be settled. "And if you'll take my advice, Sir John, you will not notice him at all. You may be sure that he has not a shilling in the world, and that he wants you to prosecute him. When you have got damages against him, he will be out of the country." "But I shall have stopped his impudent ribaldry," said Sir John Ball. Then the lawyer tried to explain to him that no one read the ribaldry. It was of no use. Sir John read it himself, and that was enough to make him wretched. The little fable which made Sir John so unhappy had not, for some months past, appeared in any of the metropolitan newspapers, but when the legal inquiry into the proper disposition of Mr Jonathan Ball's property was over, and when it was known that, as the result of that inquiry, the will in favour of the Mackenzies was to be set aside, and the remains of the property handed over to Sir John, then that very influential newspaper, which in the early days of the question had told the story of the Lion and the Lamb, told it again, tearing indeed the Littlebath Christian Examiner into shreds for its iniquity, but speaking of the romantic misfortune of the lamb in terms which made Sir John Ball very unhappy. The fame which accrued to him from being so publicly pointed out as a lion was not fame of which he was proud. And when the writer in this very influential newspaper went on to say that the world was now looking for a termination of this wonderful story, which would make it pleasant to all parties, he was nearly beside himself in his misery. He, a man of 50, of slow habits, with none of the buoyancy of youth left in him, apt to regard himself as older than his age, who had lived with his father and mother almost on an equality in regards to habits of life, the father of a large family, of which the eldest was now himself a man. Could it be endured that such a one as he should enter upon matrimony amidst the din of public trumpets and under a halo of romance? The idea of it was frightful to him. On the very day on which the result of the legal investigation was officially communicated to him, he sat in the old study at the Suitors with 2 newspapers before him. In one of these there was a description of his love, which he knew was intended as furtive ridicule, and an assurance to the public that the Lamb's misfortunes would all be remedied by the sweet music of the marriage bell. What right had any one to assert publicly that he intended to marry any one? In his wretchedness and anger he would have indicted this newspaper also for libel, had not his lawyer assured him that, according to law, there was no libel in stating that a man was going to be married. The other paper accused him of rapacity and dishonesty, in that he would not marry the Lamb now that he had secured the Lamb's fleece. So that, in truth, he had no escape on either side. For Mr. Maguire, having at last ascertained that the Lamb had, in very truth, lost all her fleece, was no longer desirous of any personal connection, and felt that he could best carry out his pledge by attacking the possessor of the fleece on that side. Under such circumstances, what was such a man as Sir John Ball to do? Could he marry his cousin amidst the trumpets and the halo and the doggerel poetry which would abound? Was it right that he should be made a mark for the finger of scorn? Had he done anything to deserve this punishment? And it must be remembered that from day to day his own mother, who lived with him, who sat with him late every night talking on this one subject, was always instigating him to abandon his cousin. It had been admitted between them that he was no longer bound by his offer. Margaret herself had admitted it. "Does not attempt to deny it," as Lady Ball repeated over and over again. When he had made his offer, he had known nothing of Mr. Maguire's offer, nor had Margaret then told him of it. Such reticence on her part of course released him from his bond. So Lady Ball argued, and against this argument her son made no demur. Indeed, it was hardly possible that he should comprehend exactly what had taken place between his cousin and Mr. Maguire. His mother did not scruple to assure him that she must undoubtedly at one time have accepted the man's proposal. In answer to this, John Ball would always assert his entire reliance on his cousin's word. "She did it without knowing that she did so," Lady Ball would answer, "but in some language she must have assented." But the mother was never able to extract from the son any intimation of his intention to give up the marriage, though she used threats and tears, ridicule and argument, appeals to his pride and appeals to his pocket. He never said that he certainly would marry her. He never said so, at least, after that night on which Margaret in her bedroom had told him her story with reference to Mr. Maguire. But neither did he ever say that he certainly would not marry her. Lady Ball gathered from all his words a conviction that he would be glad to be released, if he could be released by any act on Margaret's behalf, and therefore she had made her attempt on Margaret. With what success the reader will, I hope, remember. Margaret, when she accepted her cousin's offer, had been specially bidden by him to be firm. This bidding she obeyed, and on that side there was no hope at all for Lady Ball. I fear there was much of cowardice on Sir John's part. He had in truth forgiven Margaret any offence that she had committed in reference to Mr Maguire. She had accepted his offer while another offer was still dragging on an existence after a sort, and she had not herself been the first to tell him of these circumstances. There had been offence to him in this, but that offence had in truth been forgiven. Had there been no Littlebath Christian Examiner, no tale of the Lion and the Lamb, no publicity and no ridicule, he would quietly have walked off with his cousin to some church, having gone through all preliminary ceremonies in the most silent manner possible for them, and would have quietly got himself married, and have carried Margaret home with him. Now that his father was dead, and that his uncle Jonathan's money had come to him, his pecuniary cares were comparatively light, and he believed that he could be very happy with Margaret and his children. But then to be pointed at daily as a lion, and to be asked by all his acquaintances after the lamb! It must be owned that he was a coward, but are not most men cowards in such matters as that? But now the trial was over. The money was his own. Margaret was left standing without a shilling in the world, and it was quite necessary that he should make up his mind. He had once told his lawyer, in his premature joy, on that very day on which Mr Maguire had come to the Suitors, that everything was to be made smooth by a marriage between himself and the disinherited heiress. He had since told the lawyer that something had occurred which might, perhaps, alter this arrangement. After that the lawyer had asked no questions about the marriage, but when he communicated to his client the final intelligence that Jonathan Ball's money was at his client's disposal, he said that it would be well to arrange what should be done on Miss Mackenzie's behalf. Sir John Ball had assumed very plainly a look of vexation when the question was put to him. "I promised Mr Slow that I would ask you," said the lawyer. "Mr Slow is, of course, anxious for his client." "It is my business, and not Mr Slow's," said Sir John Ball, "and you may tell him that I say so." Then there had been a moment's silence, and Sir John had felt himself to be wrong. "Pray tell him also," said Sir John, "that I am very grateful to him for his solicitude about my cousin, and that I fully appreciate his admirable conduct, both to her and me, throughout all this affair. When I have made up my mind what shall be done, I will let him know at once." As he walked down from his lawyer's chambers in Bedford Row to the railway station, he thought of all this, and thought also of those words which Mrs Mackenzie had spoken to him in the bazaar. "You have no right to scold him yet," she had said to Margaret. Of course he had understood what they meant, and of course Margaret had understood them also, and he had not been at all angry when they were spoken. Margaret had been so prettily dressed, and had looked so fresh and nice, that at that moment he had forgotten all his annoyances in his admiration, and had listened to Mrs Mackenzie's cunning speech, not without confusion, but without any immediate desire to contradict its necessary inference. A moment or two afterwards the harpies had been upon him, and then he had gone off in his anger. Poor Margaret had been unable to distinguish between the effects produced by the speech and by the harpies, but Mrs Mackenzie had been more clever, and had consequently predicted her cousin's speedy promotion in the world's rank. Sir John, as he went home, made up his mind to one of two alternatives. He would either marry his cousin, or have Jonathan Ball's money with her. He wanted to marry her, and he wanted to keep the money. He wanted to marry her, especially since he had seen how nice she looked in black freckled muslin. But he wanted to marry her in silence, without any clash of absurd trumpets, without ridicule-moving leading articles, and fingers pointed at the triumphant lion. He made up his mind to one of those alternatives, and resolved that he would settle which on that very night. His mind should be made up and told to his mother before he went to bed. Nevertheless, when the girls and Jack were gone, and he was left alone with Lady Ball, his mind had as yet been made up to nothing. His mother gave him no peace on this subject. It was she who began the conversation on this occasion. "John," she said, "the time has come for me to settle the question of my residence." Now, the house at Twickenham was the property of the present baronet, but Lady Ball had a jointure of £500 a year out of her late husband's estate. It had always been intended that the mother should continue to live with her son and grandchildren in the very probable event of her being left a widow, and it was felt by them that their means were not large enough to permit, with discretion, separate households. But Lady Ball had declared more than once, with extreme vehemence, that nothing should induce her to live at the Suitors if Margaret Mackenzie should be made mistress of the house. "Has the time come especially to-day?" he asked in reply. "I think we may say it has come especially to-day. We know now that you have got this increase to your income, and nothing is any longer in doubt that we cannot ourselves settle. I need not say that my dearest wish is to remain here, but you know my mind upon that subject." "I cannot see any possible reason for your going." "Nor can I, except the one. I suppose you know yourself what you mean to do about your cousin. Everybody knows what you ought to do after the disgraceful things that have been put into all the newspapers." "That has not been Margaret's fault." "I am by no means so sure of that. Indeed, I think it has been her fault. And now that she has made herself notorious by being at this bazaar, and by having herself called a ridiculous name by everybody, nothing will make me believe but what she likes it." "You are ready to believe any evil of her, mother, and yet it is not 2 years since you yourself wished me to marry her." "Things are very different since that, very different indeed. And I did not know her then as I do now, or I should never have thought of such a thing, let her have had all the money in the world. She had not misbehaved herself then with that horrible curate." "She has not misbehaved herself now," said the son in an angry voice. "Yes, she has, John," said the mother in a voice still more angry. "That's a matter for me to judge. She has not misbehaved herself in my eyes. It is a great misfortune for us both, the conduct of this man, but I won't allow it to be said that it was her fault." "Very well, then I suppose I may arrange to go. I did not think, John, that I should be turned out of your father's house so soon after your father's death. I did not, indeed." Thereupon Lady Ball got out her handkerchief, and her son perceived that real tears were running down her face. "Nobody has ever spoken of your going except yourself, mother." "I won't live in the house with her." "And what would you have me do? Would you wish me to let her go her way and starve by herself?" "No, John, certainly not. I think you should see that she wants for nothing. She could live with her sister-in-law, and have the interest of the money that the Rubbs took from her. It was your money." "I have explained to you over and over again, mother, that has already been made over to Mrs. Tom Mackenzie, and that would not have been at all sufficient. Indeed, I have altogether made up my mind upon that. When the lawyers and all the expenses are paid, there will still be about £800 a year. I shall share it with her." "John!" "That is my intention, and therefore, if I were to marry her, I should get an additional income of £400 a year for myself and my children." "You don't mean it, John?" "Indeed I do, mother. I'm sure the world would expect me to do as much as that." "The world expect you! And are you to rob your children, John, because the world expects it? I never heard of such a thing. Give away 400 a year, merely because you are afraid of those wretched newspapers? I did expect you would have more courage." "If I do not do one, mother, I shall do the other, certainly." "Then I must beg you to tell me which you mean to do. If you gave her half of all that is coming to you, of course I must remain here, because you could not live here without me. Your income would be quite insufficient. But you do owe it to me to tell me at once what I am to do." To this her son made no immediate answer, but sat with his elbow on the table and his head upon his hand, looking moodily at the fireplace. He did not wish to commit himself, if he could possibly avoid it. "John, I must insist upon an answer," said his mother. "I have a right to expect an answer." "You must do what you like, mother, independently of me. If you think that you can live here on your income, I will go away, and you shall have the place." "That's nonsense, John. Of course you want a large house for the children, and I, if I must be alone, shall only want one room for myself. What should I do with the house?" Then there was silence again for a while. "I will give you a final answer on Saturday," he said at last. "I shall see Margaret before Saturday." After that he took his candle and went to bed. It was then Tuesday, and Lady Ball was obliged to be contented with the promise thus made to her. On Wednesday he did nothing. On the Thursday morning he received a letter which nearly drove him mad. It was addressed to him at the office of the Shadrach Fire Insurance Company, and it reached him there. It was as follows: Littlebath, June, 186 . Sir, you are no doubt fully aware of all the efforts which I have made during the last 6 months to secure from your grasp the fortune which did belong to my dearest friend, Margaret Mackenzie. For as my dearest friend I shall ever regard her, though she and I have been separated by machinations of the nature of which she, as I am fully sure, has never been aware. I now ascertain that some of the inferior law courts have, under what pressure I know not, set aside the will which was made 20 years ago in favour of the Mackenzie family, and given to you the property which did belong to them. That a superior court would reverse the judgment, I believe there is little doubt. But whether or no the means exist for me to bring the matter before the higher tribunals of the country, I am not yet aware. Very probably I may have no such power, and in such case Margaret Mackenzie is, to-day, through your means, a beggar. Since this matter has been before the public, you have ingeniously contrived to mitigate the wrath of public opinion by letting it be supposed that you proposed to marry the lady whose wealth you were seeking to obtain by legal quibbles. You have made your generous intentions very public, and have created a romance that has been, I must say, but little becoming to your age. If all be true that I heard when I last saw Miss Mackenzie at Twickenham, you have gone through some ceremony of proposing to her. But, as I understand, that joke is now thought to have been carried far enough, and as the money is your own, you intend to enjoy yourself as a lion, leaving the lamb to perish in the wilderness. Now I call upon you to assert, under your own name and with your own signature, what are your intentions with reference to Margaret Mackenzie. Her property, at any rate for the present, is yours. Do you intend to make her your wife, or do you not? And if such be your intention, when do you propose that the marriage shall take place, and where? I reserve to myself the right to publish this letter and your answer to it, and of course shall publish the fact if your cowardice prevents you from answering it. Indeed, nothing shall induce me to rest in this matter till I know that I have been the means of restoring to Margaret Mackenzie the means of a decent livelihood. I have the honour to be, Sir, Your very humble servant, Jeremiah Maguire. Sir John Ball, Baronet, etc., etc., Shadrach Fire Office. Sir John, when he had read this, was almost wild with agony and anger. He threw up his hands with dismay as he walked along the passages of the Shadrach office, and fulminated mental curses against the wasp that was able to sting him so deeply. What should he do to the man? As for answering the letter, that was of course out of the question. But the reptile would carry out his threat of publishing the letter, and then the whole question of his marriage would be discussed in the public prints. An idea came across him that a free press was bad and rotten from the beginning to the end. This creature was doing him a terrible injury, was goading him almost to death, and yet he could not punish him. He was a clergyman, and could not be beaten and kicked, or even fired at with a pistol. As for prosecuting the miscreant, had not his own lawyer told him over and over again that such a prosecution was the very thing which the miscreant desired? And then the additional publicity of such a prosecution, and the twang of false romance which would follow, and the horrid alliteration of the story of the two beasts, and all the ridicule of the incidents, crowded upon his mind, and he walked forth from the Shadrach office among the throngs of the city, a wretched and almost despairing man. End of chapter 28.
Chapter 29 of Miss Mackenzie by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kirsten Weber. Chapter 29. A friend in need is a friend indeed. When the work of the bazaar was finished, all the four Mackenzie ladies went home to Mrs. Mackenzie's house in Cavendish Square, very tired, eager for tea, and resolved that nothing more should be done that evening. There should be no dressing for dinner, no going out, nothing but idleness, tea, lamb chops, and gossip about the day's work. Mr. Mackenzie was down at the house, and there was no occasion for any domestic energy, and thus the evening was passed. How Mrs. Chaucer Munro and the loud bevy fared among them, or how old Lady Ware and her daughters, or the poor dear bothered Duchess, or Mr. Manfred Smith, or the kings and heroes who had appeared in paint and armour, cannot be told. I fear that the Mackenzie verdict about the bazaar in general was not favourable, and that they agreed among themselves to abstain from such enterprises of charity in future. It concerns us now chiefly to know that our Griselda held up her head well throughout that evening, and made herself comfortable and at ease among her cousins, although it was already known to her that the legal decision had gone against her in the great case of Ball v. Mackenzie. But had that decision been altogether in her favour, the result would not have been so favourable to her spirits, as had been that little speech made by Mrs. Mackenzie as to her having no right, as yet, to scold Sir John for his extravagance. That little speech made in good humour, and apparently accepted in good humour even by him. But on that evening Mrs. Mackenzie was not able to speak to Margaret about her prospects, or to lecture her on the expediency of regarding the niceness of her dress in Sir John's presence, because of the two other cousins. The two other cousins no doubt knew all the story of the Lion and the Lamb, and talked to their sister-in-law, Clara, of their other cousin, Griselda, behind Griselda's back, and were no doubt very anxious that Griselda should become a baronet's wife. But among so large a party there was no opportunity for confidential advice. On the next morning Mrs. Mackenzie and Margaret were together, and then Mrs. Mackenzie began. "Margaret, my dear," said she, "that bonnet I gave you has been worth its weight in gold." "It cost nearly as much," said Margaret, "for it was very expensive and very light."
or in bank notes either, because it has showed him and me and everybody else that you needn't be a dowdy unless you please. No man wishes to marry a dowdy, you know." "I suppose I was a dowdy when he asked me." "I wasn't there, and I didn't know you then, and can't say. But I do know that he liked the way you looked yesterday. Now, of course, he'll be coming here before long." "I dare say he won't come here again the whole summer." "If he did not, I should send for him." "Oh, Mrs. Mackenzie!" "And oh, Griselda, why should I not send for him? You don't suppose I'm going to let this kind of thing go on from month to month till that old woman at the Suitors has contrived to carry her point? Certainly not. Now that the matter is settled, of course I shall not go on staying here." "Not after you're married, my dear. We couldn't well take in Sir John and the children. Besides, we shall be going down to Scotland for the grouse. But I mean you shall be married out of this house. Don't look so astonished. Why not? There's plenty of time before the end of July." "I don't think he means anything of the kind. I don't indeed." "Then he must be the queerest man that ever I met, and I should say about the falsest and most heartless also. But whether he means to do that or does not, he must mean to do something. You don't suppose he'll take all your fortune away from you, and then leave you without coming to say a word to you about it? If you had disputed the matter and put him to all manner of expense, if, in short, you had been enemies throughout it all, that might have been possible. But you have been such a veritable lamb, giving your fleece to the shearer so meekly, such a true Griselda, that if he were to leave you in that way, no one would ever speak to him again." "But you forget Lady Ball." "No, I don't. He'll have a disagreeable scene with his mother, and I don't pretend to guess what will be the end of that. But when he has done with his mother, he'll come here. He must do it. He has no alternative. And when he does come, I want you to look your best. Believe me, my dear, there would be no muslins in the world and no starch, if it was not intended that people should make themselves look as nice as possible." "Young people," suggested Margaret. "Young people, as you call them, can look well without muslin and without starch. Such things were intended for just such persons as you and me. And as for me, I make it a rule to take the goods the gods provide me." Mrs. Mackenzie's philosophy was not without its result, and her prophecy certainly came true. A few days passed by, and no lover came, but early on the Friday morning after the bazaar, Margaret, who at the moment was in her own room, was told that Sir John was below in the drawing-room with Mrs. Mackenzie. He had already been there some little time, the servant said, and Mrs. Mackenzie had sent up with her love to know if Miss Mackenzie would come down. Would she go down? Of course she would go to her cousin. She was no coward. Indeed, a true Griselda can hardly be a coward. So she made up her mind to go to her cousin and hear her fate. The last 24 hours had been very bitter with John Ball. What was he to do, walking about with that man's letter in his pocket, with that reptile's venom still curdling through his veins? On that Thursday morning, as he went towards his office, he had made up his mind, as he thought, to go to Margaret and bid her choose her own destiny. She should become his wife, or have half of Jonathan Ball's remaining fortune, as she might herself elect. "She refused me," he said to himself, "when the money was all hers. Why should she wish to come to such a house as mine, to marry a dull husband, and undertake the charge of a lot of children? She shall choose herself." And then he thought of her as he had seen her at the bazaar, and began to flatter himself that, in spite of his dullness and his children, she would choose to become his wife. He was making some scheme as to his mother's life, proposing that 2 of his girls should live with her, and that she should be near to him, when the letter from Mr. Maguire was put into his hands. How was he to marry his cousin after that? If he were to do so, would not that wretch at Littlebath declare, through all the provincial and metropolitan newspapers, that he had compelled the marriage? That letter would be published in the very column that told of the wedding. But yet he must decide. He must do something. They who read this will probably declare that he was a weak fool to regard anything that such a one as Mr. Maguire could say of him. He was not a fool, but he was so far weak and foolish, and in such matters such men are weak and foolish, and often cowardly. It was, however, absolutely necessary that he should do something. He was as well aware as was Mrs. Mackenzie that it was essentially his duty to see his cousin, now that the question of law between them had been settled. Even if he had no thought of again asking her to be his wife, he could not confide to any one else the task of telling her what was to be her fate. Her conduct to him in the matter of the property had been exemplary, and it was incumbent on him to thank her for her generous forbearance. He had pledged himself also to give his mother a final answer on Saturday. On the Friday morning, therefore, he knocked at the Mackenzies' house door in Cavendish Square, and soon found himself alone with Mrs. Mackenzie. I do not know that even then he had come to any fixed purpose. What he would himself have preferred would have been permission to postpone any action as regards his cousin for another 6 months, and to have been empowered to use that time in crushing Mr. Maguire out of existence. But this might not be so, and therefore he went to Cavendish Square that he might there decide his fate. "You want to see Margaret, no doubt," said Mrs. Mackenzie, "that you may tell her that her ruin is finally completed." And as she thus spoke of her cousin's ruin, she smiled her sweetest smile, and put on her pleasantest look. "Yes, I do want to see her presently," he said. Mrs. Mackenzie had stood up as though she were about to go in quest of her cousin, but had sat down again when the word presently was spoken. She was by no means averse to having a few words of conversation about Margaret, if Sir John should wish it. Sir John, I fear, had merely used the word through some instinctive idea that he might thereby stave off the difficulty for a while. "Don't you think she looked very well at the bazaar?" said Mrs. Mackenzie. "Very well indeed," he answered. "Very well. I can't say I liked the place." "Nor any of us, I can assure you. Only one must do that sort of thing sometimes, you know. Margaret was very much admired there. So much has been said of this singular story about her fortune that people have, of course, talked more of her than they would otherwise have done." "That has been a great misfortune," said Sir John, frowning. "It has been a misfortune, but it has been one of those things that can't be helped. I don't think you have any cause to complain, for Margaret has behaved as no other woman ever did behave, I think. Her conduct has been perfect." "I don't complain of her." "As for the rest, you must settle that with the world yourself. I don't care for any one beyond her. But for my part, I think it is best to let those things die away of themselves. After all, what does it matter, as long as one does nothing to be ashamed of oneself? People can't break any bones by their talking." "Wouldn't you think it very unpleasant, Mrs. Mackenzie, to have your name brought up in the newspapers?" "Upon my word, I don't think I should care about it, as long as my husband stood by me. What is it, after all? People say that you and Margaret are the lion and the lamb. What's the harm of being called a lion or a lamb? As long as people are not made to believe that you have behaved badly, that you have been false or cruel, I can't see that it comes to much. One does not, of course, wish to have newspaper articles written about one." "No, indeed." "But they can't break your bones, nor can they make the world think you dishonest, as long as you take care that you are honest. Now, in this matter, I take it for granted that you and Margaret are going to make a match of it." "Has she told you so?" Mrs. Mackenzie paused a moment to collect her thoughts before she answered, but it was only for a moment, and Sir John Ball hardly perceived that she had ceased to speak. "No," she said,
She has not told me so, but I have told her that it must be so." "And she does not wish it?" "Do you want me to tell a lady's secret? But in such a case as this the truth is always best. She does wish it, with all her heart, as much as any woman ever wished for anything. You need have no doubt about her loving you." "Of course, Mrs Mackenzie, I should take care in any case that she were provided for amply. If a single life will suit her best, she shall have half of all that she ever thought to be her own." "And do you wish it to be so?" "I have not said that, Mrs Mackenzie. But it may be that I should wish her to have the choice fairly in her own power. Then I can tell you at once which she would choose. Your offer is very generous. It is more than generous. But, Sir John, a single life will not suit her. And my belief is that were you to offer her the money without your hand, she would not take a farthing of it." "She must have some provision." "She will take none from you but the one. And you need be under no doubt whatsoever that she will take that without a moment's doubt as to her own future happiness. And, Sir John, I think you would have the best wife that I know anywhere among my acquaintance." Then she stopped, and he sat silent, making no reply. "Shall I send to her now?" said Mrs Mackenzie. "I suppose you might as well," said Sir John. Then Mrs Mackenzie got up and left the room, but she did not herself go up to her cousin. She felt that she could not see Margaret without saying something of what had passed between herself and Sir John, and that it would be better that nothing should be said. So she went away to her own room and dispatched her maid to send the lamb to the lion. Nevertheless, it was not without compunction, like some twang of feminine conscience, that Mrs Mackenzie gave up this opportunity of saying some last important word, and perhaps doing some last important little act with regard to those nicenesses of which she thought perhaps too much. Mrs Mackenzie's philosophy was not without its truth, but a man of 50 should not be made to marry a woman by muslin and starch, if he be not prepared to marry her on other considerations. When the message came, Margaret thought nothing of the muslin and starch. The bonnet that had been worth its weight in gold and the black freckled dress were all forgotten. But she thought of the words which her cousin John had spoken to her as soon as they had got through the little gate into the grounds of the Suitors, when they had walked back together from the railway station at Twickenham. And she remembered that she had then pledged herself to be firm. If he alluded to the offer he had then made, and repeated it, she would throw herself into his arms at once, and tell him that she would serve him with all her heart and all her strength as long as God might leave them together. But she was quite as strongly determined to accept from him for herself no other kind of provision. That money, which for a short while had been hers, was now his, and she could have no claim upon him unless he gave her the claim of a wife. After what had passed between them, she would not be the recipient of his charity. Certain words had been written and spoken from which she had gathered the existence in Mr Slow's mind of some such plan as this. His client should lose her cause meekly and graciously, and should then have a claim for alms. That had been the idea on which Mr Slow had worked. She had long made up her mind that Mr Slow should be taught to know her better, if the day for offering alms should ever come. Perhaps it had come now. She took up a little scarf that she wore ordinarily and folded it tight across her shoulders, quite forgetful of muslin and starch, as she descended to the drawing-room in order that this question might be solved for her. Sir John met her almost at the door as she entered. "I'm afraid you've been expecting me to come sooner," he said. "No, indeed, I was not quite sure that you would come at all." "Oh, yes, I was certain to come. You have hardly received as yet any official notification that your cause has been lost." "It was not my cause, John," she said, smiling, "and I received no other notification than what I got through Mrs Mackenzie.
Indeed, as you know, I have regarded this law business as nonsense all through. Since what you and Mr Slow told me, I have known that the property was yours. But it was quite necessary to have a judgment. I suppose so, and there's an end of it. I, for one, am not in the least disappointed, if it will give you any comfort to know that. I don't believe that any other woman in England would have lost her fortune with the equanimity that you have shown. She could not explain to him that, in the first days of dismay caused by that misfortune, he had given her such consolation as to make her forget the loss, and that her subsequent misery had been caused by the withdrawal of that consolation. She could not tell him that the very memory of her money had been, as it were, drowned by other hopes in life, by other hopes and by other despair. But when he praised her for her equanimity, she thought of this. She still smiled as she heard his praise. "I suppose I ought to return the compliment," she said, "and declare that no cousin who had been kept so long out of his money ever behaved so well as you have done. I can assure you that I have thought of it very often, of the injustice that has been involuntarily done to you." "It has been unjust, has it not?" said he, piteously, thinking of his injuries. "So much of it has gone into that oilcloth business, and all for nothing." "I'm glad, at any rate, that Walter's share did not go." He knew that this was not the kind of conversation which he had desired to commence, and that it must be changed before anything could be settled. So he shook himself and began again. "And now, Margaret, as the lawyers have finished their part of the business, ours must begin." She had been standing hitherto, and had felt herself to be strong enough to stand, but at the sound of these words her knees had become weak under her, and she found a retreat upon the sofa. Of course she said nothing as he came and stood over her. "I hope you have understood," he continued, "that while all this was going on I could propose no arrangement of any kind." "I know you have been very much troubled." "Indeed I have. It seems that any blackguard has a right to publish any lies that he likes about any one in any of the newspapers, and that nobody can do anything to protect himself. Sometimes I have thought that it would drive me mad." But he again perceived that he was getting out of the right course in thus dwelling upon his own injuries. He had come there to alleviate her misfortunes, not to talk about his own. "It is no good, however, talking about all that, is it, Margaret?" "It will cease now, will it not?" "I cannot say. I fear not. Whichever way I turn, they abuse me for what I do. What business is it of theirs?" "You mean their absurd story calling you a lion?" "Don't talk of it, Margaret." Then Margaret was again silent. She by no means wished to talk of the story, if he would only leave it alone. "And now about you." Then he came and sat beside her, and she put her hand back behind the cushion on the sofa so as to save herself from trembling in his presence. She need not have cared much, for let her tremble ever so much, he had then no capacity for perceiving it. "Come, Margaret, I want to do what is best for us both. How shall it be?" "John, you have children, and you should do what is best for them." Then there was a pause again, and when he spoke, after a while, he was looking down at the floor and poking among the pattern on the carpet with his stick. "Margaret, when I first asked you to marry me, you refused me." "I did," said she, "and then all the property was mine." "But afterwards you said you would have me." "Yes, and when you asked me the second time, I had nothing. I know all that." "I thought nothing about the money then. I mean that I never thought you refused me because you were rich, and took me because you were poor. I was not at all unhappy about that when we were walking round the shrubbery. But when I thought you had cared for that man—" "I had never cared for him," said Margaret, withdrawing her hand from behind the pillow in her energy, and feeling no longer that she might tremble. "I had never cared for him. He is a false man, and told untruths to my aunt." "Yes, he is a liar, a damnable liar. That is true, at any rate." "He is beneath your notice, John, and beneath mine. I will not speak of him." Sir John, however, had an idea that when he felt the wasp's venom through his blood, the wasp could not be altogether beneath his notice. "The question is," said he, speaking between his teeth and hardly pronouncing his words, "the question is whether you care for me." "I do," said she, turning round upon him, and as she did so our Griselda took both his hands in hers. "I do, John, I do care for you. I love you better than all the world besides. Whom else have I to love at all? If you choose to think it mean of me, now that I am so poor, I cannot help it. But who was it told me to be firm? Who was it told me? Who was it told me?" Lady Ball had lost her game, and Mrs Mackenzie had been a true prophet. Mrs Mackenzie had been one of those prophets who knew how to assist the accomplishment of their own prophecies, and Lady Ball had played her game with very indifferent skill. Sir John endeavoured to say a word as to that other alternative that he had to offer, but the lamb was not lamb-like enough to listen to it. I doubt even whether Margaret knew, when at night she thought over the affairs of the day, that any such offer had been made to her. During the rest of the interview she was by far the greatest talker, and she would not rest till she had made him swear that he believed her when she said that both in rejecting him and accepting him she had been guided simply by her affection. "You know, John," she said, "a woman can't love a man all at once." They had been together for the best part of 2 hours when Mrs Mackenzie knocked at the door. "May I come in?" "Oh, yes," said Margaret. "And may I ask a question?" She knew by the tone of her cousin's voice that no question could come amiss. "You must ask him," said Margaret, coming to her and kissing her. "But first of all," said Mrs Mackenzie, shutting the door and assuming a very serious countenance, "I have news of my own to tell. There is a gentleman downstairs in the dining room who has sent up word that he wants to see me. He says he is a clergyman." Then Sir John Ball ceased to smile and look foolish, but doubled his fist and went towards the door. "Who is it?" said Margaret, whispering. "I have not heard his name, but from the servant's account of him I have not much doubt myself. I suppose he comes from Littlebath. You can go down to him if you like, Sir John, but I would not advise it." "No," said Margaret, clinging to his arm. "You shall not go down. What good can you do? He is beneath you. If you beat him he will have the law of you, and he is a clergyman. If you do not, he will only revile you, and make you wretched." Thus, between the two ladies, the baronet was restrained. It was Mr Maguire. Having learned from his ally, Miss Colza, that Margaret was staying with her cousins in Cavendish Square, he had resolved upon calling on Mrs Mackenzie, and forcing his way, if possible, into Margaret's presence. Things were not going well with him at Littlebath, and in his despair he had thought that the best chance to him of carrying on the fight lay in this direction. Then there was a course of embassies between the dining room and drawing room in the Mackenzie mansion. The servant was sent to ask the gentleman his name, and the gentleman sent up to say that he was a clergyman, that his name was not known to Mrs Mackenzie, but that he wanted to see her most particularly for a few minutes on very special business. Then the servant was dispatched to ask him whether he was the Reverend Jeremiah Maguire of Littlebath, and under this compulsion he sent back word that such was his designation. He was then told to go. Upon that he wrote a note to Mrs Mackenzie, setting forth that he had a private communication to make, much to the advantage of her cousin, Miss Margaret Mackenzie. He was again told to go,
and then told again that if he did not leave the house at once, the assistance of the police would be obtained. Then he went. "And it was frightful to behold him," said the servant, coming up for the 10th time. But the servant no doubt enjoyed the play, and on one occasion presumed the remark that he did not think any reference to the police was necessary. "Such a game as we've had up," he said to the coachman that afternoon in the kitchen. And the game that they had in the drawing-room was not a bad game either. When Mr. Maguire would not go, the two women joined in laughing, till at last the tears ran down Mrs. Mackenzie's face. "Only think of our being kept prisoners here by a one-eyed clergyman." "He has got 2 eyes," said Margaret. "If he had 10, he shan't see us." And at last Sir John laughed, and as he laughed he came and stood near Margaret, and once he got his arm round her waist, and Griselda was very happy. At the present moment she was quite indifferent to Mr. Maguire and any mode of fighting that he might adopt. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Miss Mackenzie by Anthony Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kirsten Wever. Chapter 30. Conclusion. Things had not been going well with Mr. Maguire when, as a last chance, he attempted to force an entrance into Mrs. Mackenzie's drawing-room. Things indeed had been going very badly with him. Mr. Stumfold at Littlebath had had an interview with the editor of the Christian Examiner, and had made that provincial Jupiter understand that he must drop the story of the Lion and the Lamb. There had been more than enough of it, Mr. Stumfold thought, and if it were continued, Mr. Stumfold would make Littlebath too hot to hold the Christian Examiner. That was the full meaning of Mr. Stumfold's threat, and as the editor knew Mr. Stumfold's power, the editor wisely turned a cold shoulder upon Mr. Maguire. When Mr. Maguire came to the editor with his letter for publication, the editor declared that he should be happy to insert it as an advertisement. Then there had been a little scene between Mr. Maguire and the editor, and Mr. Maguire had left the editorial office shaking the dust from off his feet. But he was a persistent man, and having ascertained that Miss Colza was possessed of some small share in her brother's business in the city, he thought it expedient to betake himself again to London. He did so, as we have seen, and with some very faint hope of obtaining collateral advantage for himself, and some stronger hope that he might still be able to do an injury to Sir John Ball, he went to the Mackenzies' house in Cavendish Square. There his success was not great, and from that time forward the wasp had no further power of inflicting stings upon the lion whom he had persecuted. But some further annoyance he did give to Griselda. He managed to induce Mrs. Tom Mackenzie to take him in as a lodger in Gower Street, and Margaret very nearly ran into his way in her anxiety to befriend her sister-in-law. Luckily she heard from Mr. Rubb that he was there on the very day on which he had intended to visit Gower Street. Poor Mrs. Mackenzie got the worst of it, for of course Mr. Maguire did not pay for his lodgings. But he did marry Miss Colza, and in some way got himself instituted at a chapel at Islington. There we will leave him, not trusting much in his connubial bliss, but faintly hoping that his teaching may be favourable to the faith and morals of his new flock. Of Mr. Samuel Rubb, Jr., we must say a few words. His first acquaintance with our heroine was not made under circumstances favourable to him. In that matter of the loan he departed very widely from the precept that honesty is the best policy.
And when I feel that our Margaret was at one time really in danger of becoming Mrs Rubb, that in her ignorance of the world, in the dark gropings of her social philosophy, amidst the difficulties of her solitude, she had not known whether she could do better with herself and her future years than give herself and them and her money to Mr Samuel Rubb, I tremble as I look back upon her danger. It has been said of women that they have an insane desire for matrimony. I believe that the desire, even if it be as general as is here described, is not insanity. But when I see such a woman as Margaret Mackenzie in danger from such a man as Samuel Rubb, Jr., I am driven to fear that there may sometimes be a maniacal tendency. But Samuel Rubb was by no means a bad man. He first hankered after the woman's money, but afterwards he had loved the woman, and my female reader, if she agrees with me, will feel that the virtue covers a multitude of sins. And he was true to the promise that he made about the loan. He did pay the interest of the money regularly to Mrs Mackenzie in Gower Street, and after a while was known in that house as the recognised lover of Mary Jane, the eldest daughter. In this way it came to pass that he occasionally saw the lady to whose hand he had aspired, for Margaret, when she was assured that Mr Maguire and his bride were never likely to be seen in that locality, did not desert her nephews and nieces in Gower Street. But we must go back to Sir John Ball. As soon as the coast was clear in Cavendish Square, he took his leave of Margaret. Mrs Mackenzie had left the room, desiring to speak a word to him alone as he came down. "I shall tell my mother to-night," he said to Margaret. "You know that all this is not exactly as she wishes it." "John," she said, "if it is as you wish it, I have no right to think of anything beyond that." "It is as I wish it," said he. "Then tell my aunt, with my love, that I shall hope that she will receive me as her daughter." Then they parted, and Margaret was left alone to congratulate herself over her success. "Sir John," said Mrs Mackenzie, calling him into the drawing-room, "you must hear my congratulations. You must indeed." "Thank you," said he, looking foolish. "You are very good." "And so is she. She is what you may really call good. She is as good as gold. I know a woman when I see her. I know that for one like her there are 50 not fit to hold a candle to her. She has nothing mean or little about her. Nothing. They may call her a lamb, but she can be a lioness too, when there is an occasion. I know that she is steadfast. That she is, and honest, and warm-hearted. And oh, Sir John, I am so happy that it is all to be made right and nice and comfortable. It would have been very sad if she hadn't gone with the money, would it not?" "I should not have taken the money, not all of it." "And she would not have taken any. She would not have taken a penny of it. Though we need not mind that now, need we? But there is one thing I want to say to you. You must not think I am interfering." "I shan't think that, after all that you have done." "I want her to be married from here. It would be quite proper, wouldn't it? Mr Mackenzie is a little particular about the grouse, because there is to be a large party at Injarrow, but up to the 10th of August you and she should fix any day you like." Sir John showed by his countenance that he was somewhat taken aback. The 10th of August, and here they were, far advanced into June. When he had left his home that morning he had not fully made up his mind whether he meant to marry his cousin or not. And now, within a few hours, he was being confined to weeks and days. Mrs Mackenzie saw what was passing in his mind, but she was not a woman to be driven easily from her purpose. "You see," she said, "there is so much to think of. What is Margaret to do if we leave her in London when we go down?
And it would really be better for her to be married from her cousin's house. It would indeed. Lady Ball would like it better, I'm sure she would, than if she were to be living alone in town, in lodgings. There is always a way of doing things, isn't there? And Walter's sisters, her own cousins, could be her bridesmaids, you know. Sir John said that he would think about it. I haven't spoken to her, of course, said Mrs. Mackenzie, but I shall now. Sir John, as he went eastwards into the city, did think about it, and before he had reached his own house that evening, he had brought himself to regard Mrs. Mackenzie's scheme in a favourable light. He was not blind to the advantage of taking his wife from a house in Cavendish Square instead of from lodgings in Arundel Street. He was aware that his mother would not be blind to that advantage either. He did not hope to be able to reconcile her to his marriage at once, and perhaps he entertained some faint idea that for the first 6 months of his new married life the Suitors would be quite as pleasant without his mother as with her. But a final reconciliation would be more easy if he and his wife had the Mackenzies of Incharrow to back them than it could be without such influence. And as for the London gossip of the thing, the finale to the romance of the Lion and the Lamb, it would be sure to come sooner or later. Let them have their odious joke, and have done with it. "Mother," he said, as soon as he could find himself alone with Lady Ball that day, not waiting for the midnight conference, "Mother, I may as well tell you at once. I have proposed to Margaret Mackenzie again to-day." "Oh, very well." "And she has accepted me." "Accepted you? Of course she has. Jumped at the chance, no doubt. What else should a pauper do?" "Mother, that is ungenerous." "She did not accept you when she had got anything." "If I can reconcile myself to that, surely you can do so. The matter is settled now, and I think I have done the best in my power for myself and my children. And as for your poor mother, she may go and die anywhere." "Mother, that is unfair. As long as I have a house over my head, you shall share it, if you please to do so. If it suits you to go elsewhere, I will be with you as often as may be possible. I hope, however, you will not leave us." "That I shall certainly do." "Then I hope you will not go far from me." "And when is it to be?" said his mother, after a pause. "I cannot name any day, but sometime before the 10th of August." "Before the 10th of August? Why, that is at once. Oh, John! And your father not dead a year!" "Margaret has a home now with her cousins in Cavendish Square, but she cannot stay there after they go to Scotland. It will be for her welfare that she should be married from their house. And as for my father's death, I know that you do not suspect me of disrespect to his memory." And in this way it was settled at the Suitors, and his mother's question about the time drove him to the resolution which he himself had not reached. When next he was in Cavendish Square, he asked Margaret whether she could be ready so soon, and she replied that she would be ready on any day that he told her to be ready. Thus it was settled, and with a moderate amount of nuptial festivity the marriage feast was prepared in Mrs. Mackenzie's house. Margaret was surprised to find how many dear friends she had who were interested in her welfare. Miss Baker wrote to her most affectionately, and Miss Todd was warm in her congratulations. But the attention which perhaps surprised her most was a warm letter of sisterly affection from Mrs. Stumfold, in which that lady rejoiced with an exceeding joy in that the machinations of a certain wolf in sheep's clothing had been unsuccessful. "My anxiety that you should not be sacrificed I once before evinced to you," said Mrs. Stumfold, "and within the last 2 months Mr. Stumfold has been at work to put an end to the scurrilous writings which that wolf in sheep's clothing has been putting into the newspapers."
Then Mrs Stumfold very particularly desired to be remembered to Sir John Ball, and expressed a hope that at some future time she might have the honour of being made acquainted with the worthy baronet. They were married in the first week in August, and our modern Griselda went through the ceremony with much grace. That there was much grace about Sir John Ball I cannot say, but gentlemen, when they get married at 50, are not expected to be graceful. "There, my Lady Ball," said Mrs Mackenzie, whispering into her cousin's ear before they left the church. "Now my prophecy has come true, and when we meet in London next spring, you will reward me for all I have done for you by walking out of a room before me." But all these honours, and, what was better, all the happiness that came in her way, Lady Ball accepted thankfully, quietly, and with an enduring satisfaction, as it became such a woman to do. End of Chapter 30. End of Miss Mackenzie, by Anthony Trollope. Recording by Kirsten Wever.